The Razee Saga. Part 11. Into the Abyss. The abyss was not still. The resonance of the watchers rippled in agitation, a chorus of voices vibrating through the rifts. Twice now their titans had been broken, their silence fractured, their fury answered with fire. It should not have been possible. The prey should have collapsed beneath the weight of oblivion, should have burned under Leviathan's rage. Instead, the prey endured. Worse, it learned. They remembered the ones that came before, and the bitter taste of that war echoed through their resonance. The ancients had failed in the end, but they had wounded. The prey now followed the same path, awakening the relics, bending silence into strength. The watchers would not allow it to happen again. Their forges groaned in the deep. Titans no longer. Titans had been arrogance, wrath given form, hunger made flesh. Instead, they wove stillness itself. They spun weapons of resonance meant not to devour fleets, but to hollow them. To reach through flesh and will, to unravel thought until commanders doubted, soldiers faltered, and unity collapsed into nothing. The prey had not yet seen such silence. When they did, they would not endure. The resonance tightened into a vow. Let them come. We will wait. And in waiting, we will end them. Weeks passed in Sentinel's orbit, but the forges never slept. The Alliance fleet stretched across the void, scarred but stronger than they had ever been. The Gemini fleet had been reforged, its warhammers rebuilt, its carriers filled, its escorts polished into disciplined steel. The walking bastions remained cloaked above the core worlds, 31 silent guardians armed with phase shifters and halo nets that drank enemy fire like water. And deeper still, the lost fleet awakened. Day by day, ship by ship, Admiralisabellavines oversaw the process. Each vessel stirred with ancient fire, its systems humming to life after millennia in darkness. Their weapons were strange, their shields stranger, their very frames humming with resonance beyond human design. The crews bent to them cautiously, learning their rhythms, their wills. Already, over 100 now followed Isabella's banner. And the anchors, those two vast enigmas she kept hidden even from the council, waited deeper still. Torque's project advanced in secrecy. Convoys moved under false manifests, cargo containers marked as hull reinforcements, carrying instead the exotic matter cores needed to forge singularity weapons. Cryon forges groaned in silence, spinning prototypes, refining stability, building toward the day when they would have enough to scatter the abyss with black holes. Few knew. Fewer still would ever be allowed to. And in Sentinel's fire, Stephen bent deeper into his bloodline's bond, peeling back secrets the planet yielded only to him. He found whispers of gates and rifts, of ways through the abyss. He could feel the tether pulsing, a line of resonance humming faintly across the void. The watchers did not know they had been found. Not yet. Fleet Admiral Buckrivers stood at the dais of the Razee Saaga's command deck, the stars stretching before him, Sentinel burning behind. Isabella stood at his side, her presence steady, her eyes sharper than the steel of her uniform. Around them, officers whispered of raids, of phantom watcher strikes at distant systems, of victories hard won and survivors few. Rivers cut through the murmurs with iron in his voice. We've spent too long waiting. Too long reacting. They've brought the war to us at every turn. That ends now. The room stilled. Officers leaned forward, breath caught. The tether we pulled from their last assault is stable. The Illyrians have confirmed its structure. The Cryons have mapped the resonance signatures. It's not a weapon. It's a path. Our path. Into the abyss. His hand tightened on the rail. We send a fleet through. Not to fight. To see. To learn. To find where they're hiding. And when the time comes, we strike. A murmur rippled across the deck, fear, awe, resolve. Isabella's voice followed, calm but firm. This is reconnaissance. Precision. We send only what can return. Zephyr will lead. Its phasing systems can slip between realities, avoiding detection. 2 cruisers and a carrier escort will follow. No more. The rest stay hidden. Rivers nodded once. Orders are given. The first recon departs at dawn. The void beyond the tether pulsed faintly, a wound waiting to be stepped through. For the first time, the Alliance was not standing guard against it. They were walking in. The tether pulsed like a vein cut across the void, a wound shimmering with resonance. To the eyes of the fleets it appeared as a thin thread of light, fragile, trembling, insignificant. Yet every Illyrian mind felt the weight of it pressing across their thoughts, a line stretched into infinity, promising both passage and annihilation. It had never been meant for prey to follow. Zephyr moved first. The fast attack cruiser shimmered, its frame half existing in 3 realities at once, its silhouette stretching and breaking, fading and returning. Its crew bent themselves to its rhythm, minds half adrift in its strange flow. Behind it came 2 cruisers and a single carrier, their hulls bristling with resonance harmonics, shields folded tight around them. Small. Purposeful. Just enough to step into the unknown. From the bridge of the Razee 2, Buck Rivers watched them fade toward the tether, his hand braced against the command rail. Isabella stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the thread, her expression unreadable to all but him. This was not defense, not survival, but the first move into enemy ground. She felt the weight of it as much as he did. The silence stretched, then broke as the recon fleet crossed the threshold and was gone. The abyss swallowed them whole. At once the laws of space bled away. Gravity folded in knots, stars bent like reflections on water, distance stretched into impossible arcs. The void was not black here but alive, filled with currents of resonance that pulsed like veins across a corpse. The crew felt it in their bones, the pressure of silence not just around them but inside them, pressing against thought, bending will. Some staggered, others clenched their jaws until their teeth bled, fighting back whispers that were not words but weight. Zephyr carried them forward, its phasing engines slipping through geometries that had no name. At times it seemed the fleet fractured, their escorts lost behind bends of space, only to snap back into view as Zephyr anchored them in its wake. Sensors faltered, screens filled with static, but the Illyrian harmonics hummed steady, drawing stolen energy from the very silence pressing against them. Time stretched, seconds becoming hours, hours becoming moments. Then the abyss opened. Beyond the veil lay a shape so vast it defied scale. It was not a fleet, not a fortress, not a world. It was all three and none. A structure woven into the resonance itself, a wound given form, a citadel of silence that pulsed across realities. Its arms stretched like broken galaxies, its core burned with a light that was not light, its surface shifted as though alive. And from it poured the resonance of the Watchers, a chorus so vast it made Leviathan feel like an echo. The recon fleet froze. Every mind felt it. Every soul knew it. This was no forward forge, no distant staging ground. This was the cradle of their enemy, the true abyssal domain. The silence pressed harder, whispers gnawing at thought, telling them to turn back, to fold into the stillness, to let themselves be unmade. For a moment, it seemed they would. For a moment, the fleet trembled at the edge of breaking. Then Zephyr phased again, shattering the resonance, its wake ripping them forward just enough to hold. Instruments stabilized, shields flared brighter, crews pulled breath into trembling lungs. The abyss receded, not defeated, but endured. The recon had succeeded. They had seen the heart of the abyss. But in the silence that followed, as the fleet turned to retreat, one truth burned into every soul. They had not been unseen. The abyss had felt them. And it would answer. The resonance stirred in fury. The prey had stepped where they should not have, their fragile minds brushing the edge of silence itself. The intrusion had not gone unseen. The abyss had felt their presence, faint but undeniable, a ripple across waters that had been still for ages. They had glimpsed what was not meant for them, what had broken the ancients before, what would break them in turn. The chorus trembled with rage, with purpose. Titans had failed. Silence-born weapons were not yet complete. But the prey needed to be reminded. They needed to bleed, to see the futility of endurance. And so a vessel was woven, smaller than Oblivion, smaller than Leviathan, but armed with a weapon no prey could understand. It would fold space itself. Weapons fired against it would not strike. Instead, they would bend, vanish, and return elsewhere. Armadas would kill themselves with their own fury, devoured not by silence but by their own blind rage. The vessel would not conquer. It would test. It would learn. And in its sacrifice, the abyss would prepare for the next silence to come. The resonance whispered as one. Send it. The Alliance Council chamber shimmered with projections, maps of fleets and sensor logs filling the air. The recon fleet's return had shaken every soul. They had seen the abyss itself, the Watcher's cradle. They had endured it, barely, and returned with proof that the war could no longer be fought at the edge. Delegates spoke over one another, the Tartans demanding immediate invasion, the Solarians urging patience, the Illyrians warning of silence unbound. Rivers stood at the dais, Isabella at his side, listening with the patience of iron. Then the alarms blared. Sentinels' deep sensors roared with warnings, their lights flaring across the chamber. Reports cut across the council floor. A Watcher incursion had breached one of the outer planets, its presence undeniable. The council erupted in panic, but Rivers raised his hand. The chamber stilled. His voice was calm, steady. The council would continue later. For now, duty called. He dispatched a fleet, warhammers and escorts burning into jump, the Razee II at their head. General Tudor stood ready, his marines armed and armored, waiting for the order. The outer planet was silent when they arrived. Its surface glowed faintly beneath its sun, its orbit filled with wreckage from colonies abandoned years before. In that silence drifted the Watcher vessel. Smaller than Leviathan, smaller than Oblivion, but alive with strange energy. Its frame bent like glass, edges shimmering as though half-phased. Sensors faltered trying to read it. The fleet spread wide, weapons primed. The first salvo fired, lances of plasma, missiles burning, storm cannons roaring. The void lit bright, fire pouring toward the vessel. And then space folded. The weapons vanished, bent into shimmering arcs, disappearing before they struck. A heartbeat later, they reappeared, not against the Watcher's ship, but against the Alliance escorts that had fired them. Explosions rippled across the formation, shields cracking, hulls burning. The fleet staggered, confusion rippling through every channel. The Watcher vessel did not fire. It did not need to. It simply folded space, turning fury against itself. Panic threatened to spread, but Rivers' voice cut through the storm, iron on steel. Hold position. Adapt. This was not a god. It was a test. And they would answer it. Arclight fired next, storm cannons chaining lightning through the void. Again the bolts bent, folding away, threatening to strike allies. But this time the fleet was ready. A new system pulsed on their cruisers, the tractor beams, freshly forged from Sentinel's forges. They locked onto the arcing bolts, freezing them mid-fold, holding them steady until they bled harmlessly into the void. The tactic worked. The beams reached farther, latching onto the Watcher vessel itself. Its shimmering frame trembled as resonance strained against them. For the first time, it faltered, held fast in place. The Alliance surged. General Tudor gave the order. Drop pods streaked from the carrier, Marines in full armor slamming into the Watcher hull. Plasma cutters burned through strange metal, airlocks ruptured, boarding bridges locked. The Marines poured inside, their weapons steady, their discipline perfect. What they found was not a crew, not a hive, but silence. The vessel was empty, save for resonance humming faintly in its walls. Still they pressed forward, clearing chamber after chamber until at last its heart was theirs. General Tudor raised the signal. The vessel was captured. For the first time in the war, the Alliance had taken a Watcher ship intact. The captured vessel hung in orbit like a shard of frozen midnight, its skin rippling with a mirage sheen that refused to hold a shape for more than a heartbeat. Tethers bit into it from every direction, anchored to a ring of armored docks built into Sentinel's shadowed side. The ring itself was new, raised in the months after Leviathan, a black cathedral of containment that Illyrian engineers called a Faraday cradle and Cryon technicians, with a curl of dry pride, called a sensible precaution. It was more than cage, it was silence made into walls. Rivers watched from the Razee 2 as the last of the umbilicals sealed. The containment generators lit one by one around the ring, a slow blooming of violet corona that climbed the captured hull and sank into its seams. The shimmering skin tried to writhe away from the light. It found nowhere to go. Isolation pressed in until even the readings grew hushed. He gave the order in the crisp cadence of a rite. Transfer the prize to the cradle. Lock it in 3 layers of silence. Nothing in. Nothing out. Stephen and the Illyrians to oversee. Cryon physicists to shadow them. Human engineers to break what could be broken and name what could not. Marines on every hatch. No assumptions. No pride. The cradle swallowed the watcher vessel whole. Inside the ring, the work began. Illyrian resonance lathes went first, sweeping the hull with harmonics that mapped stress patterns the human eye could not see. Cryon gravimeters followed, feeling for densities where no mass should exist. Human drones crawled across the plates on quiet feet, drilling coarse samples a dust grain at a time, each shaving whisked away into shielded jars that clicked shut like prayer beads. Marines stood at every junction, armor black and featureless, rifles low, patience endless. Tudor ranged the corridors with the ease of an old hunter, marking angles and kill points that would make the place honest if it proved it could not be. Every few minutes the cage hummed, the faintest note riding up through the ring's ribs as field coils flexed. The captured hull twitched when it did, a reflex more than a fight, as if some muscle deep within tried to flinch and found itself already braced by straps. Stephen came last, pale from the spire's long communion, eyes bright with the quiet burned sentinel left in him. He did not touch the hull. He did not need to. He stood within the cradle's inner gallery and breathed, listening as the planet listened, feeling as the planet felt. Threads moved in the captured ship, but not thoughts. Ropes of resonance coiled through the bulkheads, hollow and taut as bowstrings. There was purpose laced in, and it had nothing to do with travel or strength. He steadied himself and told them what the planet told him. Something here waits to be fed. They cut slower after that. They cut as if the vessel were a mine filled with radon, as if the stone might breathe and burn them all. Illyrian hands tuned the harmonics up until the field wrapped every chamber in a gauze of null, humming just under the threshold of hearing. Cryon hands anchored tripod projectors that would open a singularity the size of a pinhead and drink an entire room if any line went black. Human hands set safeties that would shear every tether and shove the prize into deep orbit if it so much as sighed wrong. They went inside. What they found did not look like a bridge. It looked like a throat. A barrel of ribbed metal ran the length of the interior, lined in plates that turned end over end in slow, patient spirals. Every meter a spiral reversed, and then reversed again, so that any energy fed into the barrel would be teased apart and braided back together into a helix that had no business existing. Tudor walked its length with his visor lights off, reading the pressure in his jaw. Space bent here even when nothing moved. They named it for their notes. The Kestrel Array. The team mapped conduits that fed into that throat from every skin seam and every false bulkhead. Each conduit ran through nodes that smelled of Leviathan's throat without carrying Leviathan's rage. There was no mouth. There was no maw. There was a pattern that asked for a key it had not been given. Overlays layered like glass across the ops table as engineers pulled the ship into mathematics. The shape of its weapon came clear in numbers before it came clear in speech. It folded space like hands folding a map and poked a path through the crease. What hit it would not hit it. What burned for it would burn elsewhere. That much the battlefield had taught them already. But here, the conduits hinted, was something stranger. The array could flip the fold before it closed, pinch it to a point, and jam that point into anything it could name. A cannon that could not miss because the target would be brought to the shot rather than the shot to the target. A surgeon's needle that worked on reality instead of flesh. The table murmured with a kind of reverence that frightened them when they heard themselves make it. Senna's people threaded Illyrian readers into the ribs and found, tucked inside the resonant braid, an aftertaste of the trap they now feared as doctrine. Not a mind, but a mimic. A seed engineered to catch the signature of a planetary biosphere and sing back in its key. Starve it and it would sleep forever. Feed it and it would answer in chorus, and the chorus would not be theirs. Stephen felt the change first. A whisper that did not come from a voice, a pressure that did not come from weight. Somewhere in the ship's throat the braid tightened as the cradle's fields dipped a fraction that no gauge called real. The hair on his arms stood. He said stop. No one laughed. Every harmonic rose at once. Cryon pin sinks armed. Marines took one half-step toward the throat without thinking. The braid relaxed again, hungry without appetite, the way a spring waits for a finger. They redlined the fields and kept them there until the floor hummed in their bones. They had proof now. The vessel had been meant for an orbit, not a duel. It would have drifted into the skies of a low-population world wearing the wreckage of an earlier war like a ragged pilgrim cloak. It would have answered challenges by folding strikes into strikes, patience itself, while its arrays sniffed the air and learned the rhythm of the planet's biosphere. When it knew the song, it would have sung. The singing would have gone into lungs as easily as oxygen. Minds would have slipped on familiar ground and never felt the push. A choir would have risen from fields and mines and habs, singing back to a throat that would open its keyhole and let a door far away unlock. It had failed here because nothing in its plans had accounted for being manhandled into a Faraday cradle and fed nothing at all. They logged it in the plain language of war. Designed vector for planetary infection via resonance entrainment. Booby device. Capture conditions prevented trigger. That was the relief. The knowledge came curled around the relief like a hook. They had it now. They had not meant to. They would be fools to ignore what they named. Cryon physicists crowded the barrel with sensors the size of gnats, tossing them across the helical veins and watching their jitter write poems in numbers. They built toy folds on the bench in glass and ion wind. The toys hiccuped and ate their own tails and collapsed with a sound like a bubble breaking. Then the toys stopped collapsing and the sound did not come. The coil on the bench shivered and held a thread of light between two plates that were not touching. A junior tech laughed and then clapped both hands over his mouth as if he had sworn in a church. Human engineers fed those numbers into tractor beam code. Beams that had caught lightning mid-arc now learned to catch a fold before it turned. They called the new routine a snare. They wrote it into destroyers first, cautious, and let the destroyers play catch in the cradle, freezing pockets of misbehaving geometry long enough to unsnarl them like sailors' knots. When they were sure the rope would hold, they packaged it for carriers and cruisers, and sent the package down the line with a stamp that said quietly and a second stamp that said now. Illyrian hands wrapped the seed behind the seed. They built a lattice that would drink its key the way the halo nets drank fire. The lattice did not chant. It hummed nonsense, soft and constant, never letting the ship's throat hear silence long enough to take a breath. Senna watched it work and nodded as if hearing a child fall asleep. Tudor ran drills until sweat ghosted his collar. Boarding. Clearing. Pinning a hull with beams and walking its spine without firing a shot. He taught his squads to listen with their teeth, to hear the difference between a corridor that held air and a corridor that held a lie. He built the lie into their VR and made them fail there until they stopped failing on the floor. Rivers walked the ring with a pace that changed nothing and changed everything. He did not put his hand on the hull. He put it on the rail, and the men and women working on the other side of that rail stood a little taller when they caught him at the edge of their vision and then forgot he was there. He watched the drums of coarse shaving stack in matched, numbered rows. He watched the crates of new coils roll out on tracked trolleys toward ships that would not speak of them in their inventories. He watched the ops tablet tally the first generation of snares installed and the second already in queue. He stood with Isabella where the cradle's light fell soft, the glow catching the steel in her hair and the long lines of her fatigue. They spoke as commanders first because the work demanded it, and then as the people they were beneath the rank because the war allowed them no other place to put their gentleness. They did not waste words. The report from the spire reached them in a threadbare courier's breath. Stephen's hand on the column, eyes unfocused, voice leveled by the planet's weight. The ship is safe now. The thing in it cannot hear us. If it had, it would have sung. They folded that line into the official record like a stave in a hymn and buried it under 3 layers of encryption that answered to 3 fingerprints and no more. In the end, the thing that mattered was written in the simplest ink. The Alliance had taken an instrument meant to make them sing to their killers. It had failed to play. They had learned its notes anyway. The Watcher vessel never left the cradle again. It hung within the cage while people in clean hoods walked its ribs and whispered to each other about curvature and stress and the taste of a fold when it licks your teeth. Some of those people went quiet after, staring too long at corners that were only corners, and Senna's team sat with them in rooms that hummed, and the hum untied the knot as often as not. The ones the hum could not reach were sent down well to fields and ocean and light. No one called that retreat. They called it repair. Snare code rolled through the fleets. Tractor beams learned a new trick and did not boast about it. The walking bastions wrote the routine across their spines in letters tall as hangar doors. The anchors, still hidden where Isabella had hidden them, took the numbers into their cores and let them sit there, inert and perfect, until the day someone would wake them with a hand flat on the console. Torque's convoys thickened on logs that did not exist, crates of dull matter with hot hearts hidden among girders and food and the nothing of formal manifests. His people did not smile when they signed for the shipments. They did not frown either. The work needed a face and theirs would do. In the rift, the chorus that had sent the test thing out tasted only its absence. It called that proof enough of prey cowardice, of prey ignorance. It did not see the ring. It did not feel the hum. It did not know a throat had been held open by a hand that would not be shaken off. Night over Sentinel's sunward face came purple and slow. The cradle's light thinned to threads and then to stars. The captured hull looked smaller in the dark, like a beetle trapped under a glass, all its cunning spent in the long twitch that had not come. The ring whispered to itself and settled. Rivers left the rail at last. In the long corridor between deck and lift, where the noise of the forge fell away and only the ship's heart remained, Isabella matched his step without asking. They did not speak of the duel to come before the tether. They did not speak of black holes coiled in crates or anchors asleep in vaults. They spoke with the warm press of shoulders and the old cadence of breath: fall in, breathe out, count to 3, keep walking. At the lift he paused and looked back once through the long window at the cage, the prize, the quiet. He let the picture fix in his mind because he would need it later when the void refused to give him anything but cold. The book of this day closed without flourish, the last line written in an engineer's hand. Trap contained. Infection averted. Principles harvested. Countermeasures deployed. Beyond Sentinel, the tether waited like a taut string, humming under the skin of space. The abyss, patient in its own cruelty, sharpened weapons of silence it believed no prey could name. Between them, a ring of light held a dead thing that had failed to sing, and in its quiet failure the Alliance found another note for the song they were learning to write. When the call came, it would be time to perform. The resonance quivered like a storm without sound. The test vessel was gone, its signal a void where once a thread had bound them to the prey. To the Watchers, silence could mean only one of 2 things. Either the prey had destroyed it, or the device had succeeded in folding itself into a world's breath and was now preparing the chorus that would rise when infection bloomed. They leaned toward triumph. The prey was clever, but not clever enough to cage a throat of the abyss. Their arrogance had always been their undoing. The chorus did not dwell. One vessel was not their strength. It had been a finger outstretched, a test of a single blade among many being sharpened. The forges burned deeper now, weaving hulls of resonance glass and corridors of folded time. Silence-born weapons grew heavier in their cradles. New vessels sang with a hunger not of teeth or maws but of thought, their purpose not to devour matter but to hollow unity. And in the heart of the rift, the citadel pulsed like a dark sun, its arms stretching across realities, preparing to birth something vast enough to drown all prey in a stillness they would mistake for eternity. They remembered the prey's intrusion into the abyss, faint and fleeting. They would not allow it again. Should the prey ever step deeper, they would find silence woven so thick it would eat even memory. The resonance sharpened as one. The next strike would not be singular. Not one planet, not one fleet. It would be many at once, a song of confusion to stretch prey lines thin and force them to reveal where their strength truly lay. The prey would burn its best fleets racing from fire to fire. And when the cracks opened, silence would pour in. The abyss stirred. The decision was made. On Sentinel, light filled the council chamber once more, but it was not the light of fire. It was the pale glow of projections, maps stretched across 3 dimensions, resonance traces from the recon fleet's passage replayed and magnified until they filled the hall with impossible geometries. Stephen stood at the center, his face drawn, his hand braced against the spire's conduit. His voice carried with the weight of what he had seen, describing the citadel that stretched like broken galaxies across the abyss, the cradle where watchers bred their silence. Zephyr's phased recordings flickered around him, hazy shapes of arms and towers and spires woven not of matter but of resonance itself. It was not a world, not a station, not anything the Alliance had a name for. It was the abyss made flesh. The council reacted as expected. Tardans demanded immediate action, insisting the tether was proof they could strike. Solarians resisted, warning of traps. Arcadians questioned whether the images could be trusted at all. Only the Illyrians spoke softly, urging patience, reminding the chamber that what they had seen was not space as mortals understood it. They argued that to rush was to step willingly into silence. Buckrivers listened from the dais, Isabella at his side. He let the storm play out, voices rising and breaking, demands clashing with fears. Torque stood in silence, eyes gleaming faintly, offering nothing. When the room grew loud enough to shake, Rivers raised his hand, and the voices broke like waves on stone. The recon had confirmed what they already knew. The Watchers had a heart, a place of origin, a citadel. The tether was real. But they were not ready. The Singularity arsenal was incomplete, the anchors untested, the bastions cloaked but unproven. To step into the abyss now would be suicide. Better to prepare. Better to sharpen every blade and every shield until the abyss had no defense. The council murmured, restless, unwilling to accept patience, but unable to deny his authority. Isabella spoke then, her voice calm but sharp, reminding them of Leviathan's corpse still studied in the forges, of the captured folding vessel locked in its cage. Every day yielded more knowledge. Every day they grew stronger. The Watchers were not waiting idly either. But when the time came, they would not meet silence with silence alone. They would answer it with fire. It seemed enough to calm the chamber. For a moment, the storm dulled. Then the alarms screamed. Sentinel's deep sensors lit the chamber in crimson. Operators cried out from their consoles, reports flooding in. Watcher incursions detected. Not 1. Not 2. 3. Simultaneous breaches across outer sectors, each one flaring bright as a wound. The council erupted into panic. 3 worlds. 3 fronts. No single fleet could reach them all in time. Rivers stood tall, the storm breaking around him. His voice cut like steel. This was the test. This was the fracture the Watchers had planned. And the Alliance would not shatter. He gave the order. Gemini would split. The Razee 2 and its core escorts would take the first sector. Isabella would lead her lost fleet to the second, her anchors still hidden in reserve. Tudor and the Marines would spearhead the third, carried by warhammers and Tardans eager for blood. The council watched in stunned silence as the decision settled. For the first time since Leviathan, Gemini would divide. For the first time, the Alliance would answer fire on 3 fronts at once. And as the fleets surged from Sentinel's docks, Stephen felt it before the sensors spoke. A tremor through the tether, faint but real, like the pluck of a string stretched taut across infinity. The abyss had felt them. The abyss was waiting. The fleets broke from Sentinel like shards of fire, 3 wings of steel carving paths toward the edges of the Alliance. Each one bore warhammers and carriers, destroyers and escorts, lost fleet vessels burning with ancient power. But this time, something new moved among them. Walking bastions. 30 in all, divided into 3 groups of 10, 1 for each front. They had drifted cloaked for months, silent guardians unseen by ally or enemy. Now they revealed themselves, vast juggernauts dwarfing even the warhammers, their frames bristling with cannons, their shields glowing with harmonics. And more than that, each bore a secret. At Rivers' command, they had been refitted with the folding technology taken from the captured Watcher vessel, rewritten and purified until it answered to human code and Illyrian harmonics. Where the Watchers had bent fire into traps, the Bastions bent it into weapons. The first incursion came into view, a planet wreathed in orbiting debris, its skies split by the shimmer of folding vessels. Alliance cruisers advanced, their salvos vanishing into bends of space, reappearing against their own shields. Panic rippled across formations. But then the Bastions moved forward. Their tractor snares lashed out, freezing the folds mid-arc. Their cores burned as they twisted the geometry back, bending the bent, turning stolen fire into lances aimed once more at the enemy. Beams that had threatened to annihilate escorts reappeared inside the Watcher hulls instead, burning them open from within. The Bastions became shields and spears both, standing immovable against the storm. On the second front, Isabella's lost fleet surged with precision. Arclight chained lightning through the void, Tempest unleashed storms that devoured entire squadrons, Zephyr phased across realities, striking from angles no enemy could track. Behind them, the Bastions bent space itself, catching volleys and returning them with merciless rhythm. Where the Watchers sought to turn the Alliance against itself, the Bastions made the abyss devour its own. The third front burned hotter still. Tudor's Marines rode with the Warhammers, their dropships primed, their armor locked. 10 Bastions anchored the formation, their shields absorbing storm after storm. One Watcher vessel tried to fold a Warhammer's salvo into the heart of a bastion, but the giant held firm, snares tightening, geometry cracking like glass. The return volley carved the Watcher hull open, leaving it writhing and half-broken. That was enough. Rivers' voice carried across the channel, cold and absolute. Immobilize it. Board it. The Bastions locked their beams across its frame, freezing the folds before they could snap shut. Dropships streaked from the carrier, Marines slamming into the twisted hull. Plasma cutters bit through ribs, corridors fell to disciplined fire, and at last the heart of the vessel lay open. Tudor himself led the final breach, his blades singing against the strange metal, his armor scorched, his will unbroken. What they found chilled even him. This vessel was not built only to fold weapons. Its core was a transmitter, resonance nodes woven into its structure, tuned to frequencies that could burrow deep into planetary crusts. It was a kill switch, meant not to hollow minds but to silence entire worlds, turning planets into lifeless stone with a single broadcast. Had it reached its target, it would have buried a song into the planet's bones. No shield, no fleet, no bastion could have stopped it. The Marines sealed the core, the Bastions dragged the vessel back into containment. The fleets secured their sectors. The incursions had been beaten, the Watchers driven back. But the lesson was clear. The abyss was no longer testing with whispers. It was building weapons to erase entire worlds. And though the Bastions had stood, though the fleets had prevailed, the war had shifted again. In the council chamber, the report scrolled in silence. Rivers read it with steel in his eyes, Isabella beside him, Tudor standing tall, his armor still scarred from the boarding. The Watchers had escalated. The tether hummed, waiting. And the Alliance knew the next step could not be delayed forever. The resonance boiled. The prey had done what should have been impossible. 3 fronts opened, 3 voices of silence sent to bend space, 3 songs to fracture unity, and all had been broken. The chorus felt the loss in waves of bitterness, each thought echoing with disbelief. Their vessels had not only failed to destroy the prey, they had been captured, their weapons turned back against them. The chorus pulsed in anguish and fury. How could prey bend silence, wield folds, hurl their own fire against them? It was not ignorance. It was theft. Somewhere within their forges, the prey had learned. Somewhere, a vessel had been broken and stripped. The resonance swirled with suspicion, blind yet burning, tasting a betrayal that could not be proven. They remembered the ancients, those who came before, who had awakened vessels from the lost fleet and believed themselves safe. The same arrogance filled the prey now. The ancients had been broken for it. These too would be broken. The forges deepened. New designs were woven. Not folding weapons, not infection songs alone, but something larger. Silence shaped not for fleets or planets, but for systems. The chorus envisioned an unmaking, a resonance that would crawl into stars and still their fire, a weapon of endings that would turn whole constellations into husks of black. If the prey wished to steal, let them. They would find only the edge of silence cutting deeper than they could imagine. The abyss whispered as one. The prey has teeth, but silence does not bleed. In Sentinel's orbit, the captured vessel hung silent in its Faraday cradle. Its skin no longer shimmered, its folds no longer bent space, but its core hummed faintly, a vibration too deep for ears, too strange for machines. The planetary kill switch, the transmitter designed to seed resonance into crust and mantle until a world sang itself into death. The cradle's harmonic shields wrapped it, layers of null that drowned its voice, but within that silence the engineers worked. Illyrian resonance mappers traced every line of its throat, mapping conduits that could reach through planetary stone. Cryon physicists unraveled the nodes, diagramming frequencies that could twist geology into song. Human technicians crawled across its ribs, logging pathways that could never be allowed to pulse again. Stephen stood in the gallery, pale but steady, his hand pressed against the spire's conduit, feeling what Sentinel felt. He described it in words that chilled even hardened commanders. Had this vessel reached orbit, the planet beneath would not have burned, it would have fallen quiet. Oceans would have calmed, winds would have stilled, fires would have gone out. Entire ecosystems would have simply stopped, as though erased from memory. Not destruction, but annulment. The chamber shivered at his words. The engineers continued. From the broken throat of the vessel, they learned more than its danger. The same folds that could drive resonance into stone could also be bent to block it. Counterharmonics were built, new shield nodes woven, capable of holding resonance waves at bay. For every silence the abyss forged, the Alliance would weave a voice to deny it. Rivers stood with Isabella and Torque above the cradle, watching the diagrams bloom. The vessel was a trap, but it had failed. And in its failure, they had stolen its weapon. Already, defensive lattices were being installed across the fleets. Already, bastions had been retrofitted with snares that could catch not just folded beams but folded resonance itself. Torque's report was colder still. 100 singularity weapons were ready. His people had completed them in secrecy, each core contained, each self-erasing after collapse. But to carry them into the abyss would be suicide without folding upgrades. Any fleet that fired blind in watcher space would destroy itself before it struck. With the prey's own weapons stolen and reshaped, the Singularity fleet could survive the crossing. Isabella's gaze was steady, her voice sharp with caution. To wield so much abyssal technology was to risk becoming what they fought. Shields that hummed like watcher throats. Weapons that folded like their prey's own claws. Anchors waiting in secret, their purpose still hidden even from the council. Buckrivers listened, his eyes hard, his voice iron. War left no space for purity. If the abyss bled weapons into their skies, the Alliance would take them, break them, bend them, and return them sharpened. To fight half-armed was to die. And they would not die. The cradle hummed, the captured vessel bound in silence. The engineers logged their progress, the fleets refitted, the Singularity arsenal prepared. Each step was another stone placed on the path into the abyss. And in the depths of the tether, unseen, something vast began to stir. The war table filled the Razee 2 strategium like a low star, light spilling over armor and tired faces, over hands that had learned the shape of defeat and the heavier shape of endurance. Rivers stood at the prow of that light with Isabella to his right and Torque a measured shadow to his left, the projection throwing maps across them in cold color. The tether arced through the display as a single burning thread. Around it bloomed the calculus of invasion. They built the strike the way engineers build bridges across gorges no one should cross. First the anchors, hidden still in vault dark, marked only as Archon 1 and Archon 2, their task to hold the wound open, to catch the slip of space when it tried to heal and to nail it to geometry that would obey mortal orders. Around that hinge, 3 axes of entry, not one, Zephyr's phasing spearhead plodded through the soft ribs of the abyss where recon had shown currents thinner, a lost fleet wedge cut for shock and bleed, built to break what needed breaking, and a cold convoy that wore no heraldry at all, a river of hulls carrying the singularities that would be the Alliance's answer to silence. Torque spoke in numbers and tolerances, in the plain language of a people who had willed gravity to kneel. 100 cores sat caged and patient. Each had breathed in its pinprick event and collapsed it behind glass until called. Each could bloom for 30 heartbeats and each ships or stations or the shared spine of a citadel that dared to stand. Each would self-erode to dust when its breath was done. They would not leave gifts behind for the abyss to copy. They would leave nothing. Isabella layered the doctrine over the bones of the plan like muscle. No ship would cross naked into that dark. Fold tech would ride in every spine and ring, taught not to mirror watcher malice but to refuse it, to hold incoming fire in mid-arc and return it along the same seam. Tractor snares had learned a new grammar, a wrist-flick cadence for freezing geometry before it snapped. They would move in batteries now, bastions anchoring the chorus with the patient tempo of mountains. Carrier wings would fly inside the light cones of bastions to keep their own volleys from turning traitor. Lightning and storms would strike only through cleared corridors, never across the field. Every tool had an answer. Every weakness had a brace. Rivers bound it all together in the ruthless economy of command. The first wave would not seek glory. It would seek position. Anchors to the hinges. Bastions to the wall. Wedge to the throat. Then the silence would be flooded with sound no watcher had heard from prey. The hush of 100 cores waking in staggered cadence, the low note of a war chosen rather than suffered. Gemini would not spend itself at the door, it would kick the frame off its hinges and build a hallway where none had been. He held the table there, on the edge of the moment before orders become fate, and looked past light and argument to the people whose hands would carry them. Isabella's face held the same tempered calm she had worn in the expanse, a forge's glow at the edges softening iron. Torque's eyes caught the cold star map and gave nothing back but assent. It would be enough. The strategium's doors sealed the way lids close when a sleeper drops deep. Outside, Sentinel breathed in measured pulses through the ship's bones. Inside, they walked the plan again, not to polish it but to feel its weight settle where it had to settle or break them later. They paced their waypoints by hours and by burns and by the length of a human hand closing and opening, rehearsed handoffs soundless and sure, parceled risk like rationed air. They did not pretend the fold tech was safe. They did not sanctify it either. They named it a borrowed knife, a blade wrapped in Illyrian hum so the grip would not numb their fingers, and they resolved to put it down when its work was done. Isabella called that vow aloud without adornment and Rivers answered by writing it into the operations slate where even Zeal could read it when Zeal's blood ran hot. The message traffic thinned to essentials. Convoys that were not convoys dissolved into the background noise of a million ships and reassembled on schedules no clerk saw. The bastions drifted into new shadows where shadows could hold their weight. The lost fleet tuned its alien hearts to a single beat. Zephyr's deck lights dimmed and brightened in a rhythm crews learned without clocks, teaching breath to match the ship. Down in the dark, Archon 1 and Archon 2 slept in their coffins of crystal and dull metal, dreams measured in microvolt creep and the slow elastic sigh of stressed spacetime finding a new, uneasy rest. Progress reports climbed like scaffolds. Fold arrays seated in 90% of designated hulls. Snares propagated across the warhammers. Carrier wings certified on new return fire corridors. Bastions 99% code aligned, One outlier burned down and rebuilt rather than trusted. Torque's people sent a final packet that read like a prayer and a threat. Cores at 100 count. Failsafes verified. Self-erasure rehearsed until no residue remained. On a separate channel that bore no name, 3 hull numbers updated from empty to loaded, then to out. Senna drifted through the work like a tall shadow painted in quiet light. Her cadre walked the ranks of operators and marines and techs with portable hums that kept minds smooth, stitched resonance shields into the places that armor left bare. The Watchers would want thought more than blood in the abyss. The Alliance would not arrive with minds unguarded. Stephen's absence rippled at first as relief. When his voice did not come through the intercoms, no one had to remember how narrow the bridge between safety and blasphemy had been when the kill switch's throat almost heard them. The relief lasted until the Spire sent a tremor up through Sentinel's mantle that every ship in orbit felt as a fractional blur in sensor baselines and a taste of metal under the tongue. It was not a quake. It was not anything a gauge could label. It was the feeling of something vast rolling over in sleep. He came over the ship net without preface, a thread pulled straight from stone. The tether has tightened. The other end is changing its weight. The Citadel is not still. The Strategium's light acquiesced to a new layer of forms the recon suite had not seen before. Far past their side of the wound in space, structures within the abyssal citadel buckled and unbuckled like a heart finding a new cadence. Arms extended. Towers retracted. A dark corolla of geometry unfurled around a central absence that ate simulation time like flame eats paper. Even in models that did not respect the abyss's rules, everything that moved seemed to move with the purpose of closing a hand. Isabella read it for the thing it resembled most to a soldier. The Watchers were not deepening a lair. They were sighting a weapon. The petal-like geometry was not ornament. It was an aperture. Rivers narrowed the plan to a line and then sharpened the line to a point. Timelines tightened. Standing slates slid from days to hours, from hours to a run of linked minutes, each one heavier than logic allowed. The full tech crews rode hard checks into black coffee and got up twice without being told. Bastion captains moved their giants a ship length here, 5 there, until a wall of invisible stone threw its shadow across the places the abyss would need to reach. Torque spoke one more number they had not wanted to hear. If the aperture was what it appeared to be, if the Watchers meant to pour a system kill through the tether or to yank a star by its roots, then the Alliance would not have the luxury of rehearsal. The cores would have to go sooner than comfort allowed. The convoy would have to break cloak and push now, or the target would disappear into a geometry none of their models could follow. There was no protest. There was only work. On docks darkened to moonlight, loaders trundled the last of the sealed canisters into skinned hulls that wore borrowed registrations and ballast scars painted in grease. Cryon officers stood with tablets that hummed faintly and nodded once when the weight felt right. Human petty officers signed cargo sheets that showed nothing but water and ballast and the lies wars must tell to stay alive. Illyrian observers wrapped each hull in a cocoon of hum that would keep stray resonance from tasting the cores like sugar. Rivers dismissed the larger council in silence and kept only the few he would burden. Isabella remained because the plan had shaped itself to her hand for months and would not bear another grip. Torque remained because gravity did not care for permission and neither did he. Stephen remained because Sentinel would not allow him to go and he no longer argued with the planet that had made his blood sing. He laid the final board open without ceremony. 3 entry axes became 2, became 1, became a pattern that could blur under the right hum. Anchors would wake on staggered pulses. Bastions would stack their shields in vertical tiers against a horizontal flow, an unnatural crossing that put geometry on their side for once. The wedge would not wedge. It would thread. The convoy would not lag behind. It would go through first, low and slow in the lee of return fire, and it would not stop to fight anything that did not pull it out of its lane and break it. The only glory offered would be survival. The planet's slow hum crept into the room as if Sentinel had leaned close. The ship net thinned into the kind of quiet that only comes when every station is manned and no one needs to speak to know what to do next. Rivers closed the table and the light died into a map of stars every person in the room had loved since childhood and feared since the war began. He did not lift his hand. He let the order carry through the bones of the ship the way storms carry through a sea, the order that gathered 1,000 smaller orders and made them one motion. Prepare to step. The tether thrummed. The citadel's petals turned, the aperture finding its aim with the languor of a predator that has never had to run. On the anchorage, bastions rolled their shoulders and let harmonics climb to the brink of pain. Far below, in vaults no chart acknowledged, Archon 1 flexed and the air around it went thinner, and technicians staring at screens felt their eyes water for no reason and did not rub them because their hands were busy. Stephen's voice came again, softer, the way tide marks are soft on stone. When it opens, it will try to make us forget we are here. It will try to name us in its language. Do not answer. Hold to your names. Isabella's glance met Rivers and did not need words. He touched the console with 2 fingers and gave the gesture a promise's weight. The convoy shifted. The first of the loaded hulls slid forward. Zephyr's lights went low and then lower, until Crew's skin seemed to glow in its wake. Across the line, 1,000 small mechanical hearts took one long breath in. Somewhere beyond sight, the abyss turned its face fully toward them. On Sentinel's night side, the captured kill switch slept inside its cage and the ring hummed a lullaby to a throat that would never sing. On the day side, the forges burned like a crown. Between them, stretched tight as wire, lay the line they had chosen. The resonance was alive with hunger. The chorus gathered around the aperture, a geometry vast enough to eclipse thought itself. Its petals stretched wide, arms unfurling like an ancient bloom, each tower bending not light, not matter, but silence. It was no cannon in the mortal sense, no weapon of crude fire. It was a song of annulment, tuned to reach across systems, to find the pulse of a star and still it. The prey had resisted oblivion. The prey had killed Leviathan. The prey had stolen folds and returned them as weapons. None of it mattered now. When the aperture sang, it would not matter how many ships they built, how many stolen weapons they carried, or how many anchors they raised. A sun itself would fall quiet. Planets would cool into lifeless stone. Oceans would turn to black glass. Life would remember only for the length of a single breath, then memory itself would be erased. The resonance pulsed in triumph. Soon the prey would learn what silence truly was. On Sentinel, the tether hummed like a wound pressed too long. Its thread burned bright across the strategium of the Razee 2, a single line stretched into the abyss. At its edge, the Singularity convoy waited, a river of hulls carrying the Alliance's darkest promise. Rivers stood at the dais, shoulders like stone beneath the weight. Isabella was to his right, her eyes narrow, steady, the commander of a lost fleet that had grown past 100 vessels. Torque loomed on his left, sharp and cold, the architect of 100 Singularity cores now hidden in their convoy. Stephen leaned against the conduit, his gaze unfocused, Sentinel's breath running through his blood. The order was given. The anchors awoke. Archon 1 and Archon 2 stirred in vaults hidden from council eyes, vast frames unlike any ship built in human memory. Their cores thrummed with harmonics no species had words for, relics not of prey, not of Illyrians, not of Cryons, but of those who had come before. As their systems lit, space itself bent. The tether stretched, its edges trembling as though to heal. The anchors sank their resonance into it and held it open. For the first time, the wound in reality did not close. It remained fixed, a door nailed in place, shimmering like heat above stone. The convoy moved. Zephyr phased first, its silhouette unraveling into 3 realities at once, blazing a path into the abyss. Behind it came the bastions, 10 giants braced like walking continents, shields flaring bright, fold arrays burning with stolen fire. They surrounded the convoy in walls of harmonic steel, their snares ready to catch any fold that threatened to twist against them. Inside their shadow, the Singularity ships drifted in silence, each one bearing a core that could unmake stars. The crossing was agony. The abyss pressed in, reality stretched thin, currents of resonance lashing against hulls. Screens blurred, sensors faltered, mind strained beneath whispers that were not words but weight. Some crews trembled, Others clenched their jaws until blood ran in their mouths, fighting back the silence that tried to fold them into nothing. But the anchors held the tether. The bastions held the wall. Zephyr danced across impossible geometries, guiding them forward. And then, they were through. The abyss opened before them. No stars. No sun. No horizon. Only a sea of shifting currents, rivers of resonance pulsing in arcs too vast for mortal thought. Shapes moved at its edges, vast silhouettes that might have been towers or fleets or both, bending across realities. And at its center, looming like a broken galaxy, pulsed the citadel itself, its aperture opening wider, petals stretching as though to embrace them. The convoy held formation. The bastions braced. The singularity cores slept in their cages. For the first time in the war, the Alliance had not waited. They had stepped into the abyss itself. And the abyss was waiting. The first shapes came like knives thrown from the dark. Small, fast, and cruelly elegant, they slit through the resonance like swallows through storm, their hulls slipping from one geometry to another with insect certainty. Sensors named them and then unnamed them as they phased across the seams of perception. Harriers, not leviathans, not gods. Tools meant to peel escorts from convoys, to sever arteries and let the body bleed out in panic. Zephyr moved to meet them, 3 silhouettes trembling into 6 and then 9 as its multiversal wake braided reality behind it. Lances of phase fire crossed the paths of the Harriers, not chasing them but arriving where they would be a heartbeat later. A handful flashed into shards and went dark, their resonance collapsing like punctured lungs. The rest adapted. They bent, folded, reappeared in the convoy's shadow where their shots would force bastions to choose between shield and snare. The bastions did not choose. They carried both in the same breath. Harmonic walls rose around the convoy in layers, each plate of light tuned to drink the watcher's folding geometry, each tractor snare written with the new grammar learned in the cradle. Fire came in, inverted on itself, dimmed, and shuddered back out along the same crease with a violence that made space ring like struck glass. The Harriers discovered the new fact of this war: the Alliance had learned to make the abyss bite its own tongue. Warhammers roared in disciplined arcs from behind the bastion's shoulders, letting the giants set corridors and then pouring ordnance through those safe channels with iron patience. Carrier wings flew inside the light cones of the harmonic shields, never outrunning the sanctuary, never bragging with a reckless kill. Interceptions were surgical, recoveries exact, losses unglamorous and blessedly few. The lost fleet's eldest sang in their strange voices, arclight chaining brilliance through clusters of Harriers until whole knots of them went limp, tempest unfolding pocket weather that chewed formation into chaff. Zephyr, always Zephyr, needles of reality stitching shut escape paths an instant before the enemy slipped through. On the convoy decks, crews did the quiet hero's work. They held course. They watched the bastions timing pulses and rode the beats as if the drums themselves were engines, never surging, never lagging, never giving the enemy a misstep to exploit. In the cargo holds, 100 caged cores waited without ego, their self-erasure routines humming like monks at prayer. A lone Harrier got too bold. It folded inside a bastion's shadow, popped into being close enough to lick the giant's armor with a beam meant to carve. The snare caught its fold mid-hinge and held it like a trapped hinge. The bastion turned that arrested crease a quarter revolution, returned the shot down the captured seam. The Harrier opened along the line where it had expected space, not fire, and died without a voice. The third front of the fight bloomed within the first. Tudor had watched for the pattern, the way a tracker reads brush for the one broken reed that says a stag has passed. 2 Harriers kept slipping out of annihilation by a hair that felt less like luck and more like coordination. He marked their pivots and saw the pivots sink to a point deeper in the pack, a spine the others leaned on, a relay, not a brawler, carrying more node than gun. The order traveled as a pulse rather than a word. Bastions tightened a cage no Harrier could see, 2 destroyers slid sidewise on identical burns until the relay's fold had nowhere to land but their waiting snares. It tried to turn left and found left already occupied by geometry locked in place. It tried to phase right and discovered right had been written out of the paragraph. It hung, wrong-footed in a universe it could not edit, and Tudor went. Dropships stitched across the last meters like black sewing needles. Armor-kissed hull. Plasma cutters wept incandescent lines. Marines moved in the grammar they had practiced until sleep had nothing left to teach. 1 watches, 2 clear, 3 checks the breadth of the corridor and listens with his teeth for resonance that tries to lie. The relay's skin flexed in denial, tried to make 2 parallel hallways occupy the same space. The squad answered with a hum Senna had given them for nightmares. The lie unknotted into mere metal. The heart of the vessel did not resemble a core so much as a chapel built around a negative. Ribs arched, not to hold weight but to teach it what shape to take. Between them, braided conduits carried a cold song. Tudor stepped to the rail, let his visor filters thin, and saw the truth of the relay. Not a weapon, not a pilot, not even a proper brain. A mouth on a stalk, tuned not to speak but to carry a sound from far away to everywhere at once. He could feel it trying to hear. He could feel what it wanted to hear most, the long note of the aperture, the system killer's first syllable, translated across a lacework of identical mouths until distance ceased to matter and an entire sky learned one terrible word for quiet. He marked the nodes. Teams moved with the exactitude of surgeons who hate applause. Charges were set where structure could lose voice without gaining rage, where power could drain without bursting into shrapnel. On his count, the relay stuttered, lifted all its ribs at once like a startled animal, and sagged. Marines held their breath until the vessel's false corridors relaxed into simple hallways and the floor remembered itself. The prize was taken, silent now, carried in bastion snares like a dangerous relic to the rear. Across the formation, the Harriers faltered. A dozen feeds began to lag, then glitch, then drop. Return fire corridors found no one at the far end to send pain into. The pack broke the way flocks do when the one bird that really knows where to go simply vanishes. Confidence dissipated into pointless speed. Bastions anchored. Warhammers harvested. Carriers closed hands around stragglers and squeezed. On the far edge of the engagement envelope, Zephyr slipped deeper and saw what no map had given permission to exist. Waypoints, yes, crisp silhouettes against resonance currents, but also what lay between them, thin bridges of geometry, thread-like, nearly nothing, upon which Harriers skated like spiders on dew. The Citadel was not a castle on a hill. It was a city with roads. Roads meant traffic. Traffic meant schedules. Schedules meant a thing the prey had been denied for years, the power to be where the enemy did not expect them to be. Zephyr tagged coordinates with the delicacy of a thief marking windows. The marks rode back to the bastions on beams already trained to carry foreign things without flinching. The giants stored the marks like grudges. The first battle in the abyss did not end with a cheer. It ended the way good work ends, with wrists gone tight and backs gone loose, with a check of counts and a counting of checks, with the quiet astonishment of surviving exactly as planned. The convoy had its lane. The bastions held their wall. The relay was in custody. Losses existed and they hurt, but they had names and numbers and none of them had been planets. Stephen felt the change before the reports reached the table. It came like a drop in barometric pressure that only bones know how to read, like the silence in a forest when every creature that can flee already has. He leaned his forehead against the conduit and Sentinel breathed through him, old stone speaking without language. The tether tightened the way rope does when something enormous on the far end lifts its head. The aperture began to sing. It did not point at the convoy. That would have been mercy. It turned, pedals aligning with a precision that mocked engineering, and sighted down a line that was not a line so much as an intimacy. The tether offered itself like a nerve. The abyss exhaled along it. On the far side, in real space, an alliance system woke to a wave it could not name. Boards lit along the convoy with echoes and with hollows. The bastion's harmonics recoiled as if struck by a word. Snares reached and found nothing to catch because what moved was not a beam but a command to matter to remember stillness. Stephen said the system's name without saying it aloud, voice breaking in exactly the tone no one in a war room ever wants to hear. A minor world, a mining belt, a string of cold towns and hungry docks and stubborn light. Rivers did not waste the heartbeat he had. Orders fell without rising to speech. Bastions turned their shields outward and then inward both, writing a counter-hum across the tether, a false echo to muddy the path. Zephyr plunged into an angle only it could survive and snapped a mark on the aperture's lip that would mean something later. The convoy's singularity hulls huddled tighter, hulls kissing in a geometry the abyss found distasteful, as if modesty itself were a shield. On the far side, defense grids groaned awake. Halo nets flared, hungry for any energy they could drink, but the wave arriving was not the kind they had been born to feast on. It did not burn. It forgot. Senna's teams on that world, thinly spread, working clinics and docks because the war had demanded too much elsewhere, switched on portable hums and turned auditoriums and hangars into shelters for minds, not bodies. The wave met their lullabies and blurred at the edges, losing the knife edge of its first letter. A desperate, tiny mercy. Within the abyss, Torque's numbers arrived at the exact moment when numbers must become courage. The cores were ready. The convoy could either hold, watch, and lose the system to a word, or move, risk, and interrupt a song by breaking the instrument. There was no comfortable third answer. Rivers took the only path war had left him. The convoy angled toward the citadel as a flock turns, not with barked commands but with momentum and trust. Bastions layered their snares in a pattern that made no sense except against the study of the captured throat. They were not aiming to catch the song but to catch the singer's breath between notes. The lost fleet shifted into a geometry that had no beauty until one saw what it made room for, the slow, implacable approach of Archon One's distant hum as the first anchor reached for a deeper hold on the tether's throat. The aperture widened. The wave thickened. On the far side, instruments on a mining moon recorded a minute of absolute quiet and then wept ink across paper as noise returned like rain to a tin roof. Whole valleys forgot wind and remembered. Some did not. The line between those truths would make a crooked scar on maps no one had drawn yet. Tudor's captured relay, still cocooned in a bastion's hold, pulsed once as if in reflex. Senna's people caught that flinch inside a cage of nonsense and sang back a lullaby that sounded like a mother making up words because the true ones are too sharp. The relay settled. Stephen spoke one last time into the net with a steadiness borrowed from stone. The next breath from the aperture will be stronger. We must make it cough. The cores woke. Not all. Not yet. A handful, a stuttering cadence, enough to teach the citadel the taste of its own throat. In cargo bays, cages opened with the courtesy of guillotines. In control rooms, hands that had been calm for hours trembled once and found stillness again. In the abyss, points like pits appeared where nothing had been, not holes in space so much as refusals to be described. The first black flowers bloomed. The aperture hesitated, discovering for the first time a silence it had not imposed. Its petals trembled. The wave thinned. The bastions pushed their snares into the gap like wedges into a door. Zephyr slashed a seam along the lip with a thread of phase fire too fine to be seen and too honest to be denied. The convoy held. On the far side, the mining towns found their sound again all at once. 100,000 throats took the same surprised breath. Somewhere in a dockside clinic an Illyrian and a human looked at each other and laughed the way survivors do when there is no room left for eloquence. In the abyss, the citadel drew breath for a second note. The convoy turned its prow to meet it. The drop ended not with a victory, not with a collapse, but with a poised blade and a singer clearing its throat. The Alliance had taken a step no prey should take and not fallen. The Watchers had fired into real space through a nerve and been made to falter. Between those truths stretched the line they would walk to the end, bastions braced, anchors humming, Zephyr threading impossible paths, 100 black hearts ready to open, a promise on River's table written in work rather than words. The abyss inhaled. The Alliance did not blink. The strategium was a sea of alarms. The tether glowed across the display like a vein stretched between realities, once steady, now trembling. Sensor echoes screamed, their graphs spiking into chaos, their warnings blaring across every deck. Officers called out numbers they could hardly believe, energy readings surging beyond what even Leviathan had produced. The aperture was blooming again. Stephen staggered against the conduit, his face pale, his breath ragged. His voice carried no need for translation. They are aiming at the tether. Not the fleet. Not the system behind us. The tether. They mean to cut us off. A silence colder than vacuum fell across the strategium. Every officer understood. If the tether collapsed while they were inside the abyss, the fleet would not die quickly. It would not even burn. It would simply vanish, folded into silence, unremembered even by itself. Rivers' voice cut through the fear, iron steady. Bastions to the wall. The Titans moved. 30 giants, harmonic cores blazing, folded into formation around the anchors. They layered their shields like stone upon stone, each plate of light resonating against the next, building a wall of hum vast enough to cover the tether itself. Their tractor snares reached into the abyss, locking points of geometry in place so the wave would have to shatter against them instead of slipping through. Isabella's orders echoed next, sharp and exact. Lost fleet forward. Arclight, Tempest, Zephyr, to the flanks. Catch the Harriers before they pierce the wall. No gaps. No mercy. Her ships surged ahead, their alien weapons singing in defiance. Arclight's chained lightning crackled across impossible space, vaporizing clusters of Harriers before they could close. Tempest uncoiled storms that swallowed entire swarms, breaking them into shreds of resonance. Zephyr vanished into fractured reality, reappearing behind pursuers, striking like a phantom from a dozen angles at once. Still, the Harriers came. Faster, more coordinated than before, darting toward weak points in the bastion's shield wall. They bent fire through folds, trying to drive Alliance salvos into the anchors themselves. But the bastions were ready, their snares latching onto the folds mid-arc, freezing them and snapping them back. Every Harrier that tried to bend space found its own shots returned, tearing its frame apart from within. The anchors thrummed, their cores burning brighter than stars. They held the tether open with a strain that shook the fleet itself, every hull vibrating with the resonance. Crewmen clutched consoles, teeth rattling, as harmonics roared through them like storm winds. Then the wave came. The aperture flared, its petals stretching wide, its throat glowing with silence. The resonance sang, not to burn, not to hollow minds, but to erase. It reached across the abyss and struck the tether. The anchors shuddered. Every ship felt it at once. The universe tilted, a tug at the edges of perception, as though the abyss itself was trying to forget them. Panels flickered, sensor returns dropped, minds blurred, names slipped from lips before they could be spoken. The wave did not attack the hull. It attacked reality itself, trying to shear them loose from memory, to make them untethered fragments drifting in silence. Bastions roared in defiance, their shields blazing brighter, their fold tech arrays seizing pieces of the resonance wave and hurling them back into the abyss. The giants bent silence against itself, blunting the worst of the strike, but the cost was immense. Crews screamed as harmonics burned through marrow, consoles sparked, shields flickered. The anchors wavered, their hold trembling, the tether pulsing like a wound about to heal closed. Stephen clutched the conduit, his eyes blazing, his voice raw. If the conduit snaps, we are lost. We must break their song. The wave deepened, its pressure mounting, its silence thickening. Harriers surged harder, throwing themselves at the wall, not to kill but to distract, to weaken. The anchors dimmed, the tether flickering. Buck Rivers' voice cut the chaos like a blade. Hold. The fleets held, bastions straining, anchors groaning, lost fleet cutting swathes through the Harriers. But everyone knew it was not enough. Unless the source of the resonance was broken, the next pulse would sever the tether completely. And somewhere in the abyss, hidden among the swarms, a larger relay ship pulsed brighter than the rest, its core echoing the aperture's song, amplifying its power, feeding it into the tether's throat. Tudor saw it. And he prepared to go. The relay pulsed with the rhythm of the aperture, each beat a hammer stroke driving into the anchor's hold. It was larger than the Harriers, more deliberate in its geometry, its ribs woven to catch and magnify the song of silence. While the bastions locked their shields and the lost fleet fought like wolves at bay, that single vessel fed the abyss what it needed to sever the tether. Tudor's voice cut across the net, calm in the way of men who had carried fear so long it turned to steel. Mark that ship. It's the throat of their choir. Tractor snares leapt from 2 bastions, freezing the relay mid-shift, locking its fold halfway closed. The vessel thrashed against the binds, space around it cracking like glass under strain. Marines cheered without speaking, the roar in their throats carried only in the pressure of their breathing. Dropships launched, burning like comets, racing through arcs of bent geometry. They slammed onto the relay's hull, armor grinding, cutters sparking. The hull bent beneath them, corridors trying to overlap, rooms folding into each other like paper pressed too tight. Marines pushed forward anyway, their suits humming with Illyrian lullabies sewn into the armor to keep their minds whole. Plasma fire cut shadows into the walls, storm rifles tore apart resonance nodes that screamed without voices. Every step was fought not against soldiers, but against the ship itself, a structure that did not want to be walked. Tudor led from the front, blade in hand, its edge tuned to burn where silence tried to hide. He forced the way through chambers that smelled of lightning and void, through corridors that flickered between dimensions. His Marines followed, boots pounding, weapons steady. They reached the core. It was a cathedral, ribs arched to the throat, conduits pulsing with resonance, each one a thread in the aperture's song. Energy thrummed through it, a heartbeat not its own, the voice of the citadel poured through a mouth meant only to magnify. Charges were placed in silence. No words wasted. Each Marine knew the pattern. Tudor walked the length of the chamber one last time, his eyes catching the rhythm of the conduits, the pulse of the wave. He marked the final spot with his blade's point. Detonate. The ship shook as if it screamed. Conduits shattered, resonance burst in showers of light. The cathedral collapsed inward, its throat silenced, its ribs folding until they were nothing but broken lines. Marines staggered back to the dropships, the bastions dragged the relay's carcass deeper into snares, locking it away from the aperture's song. And then, the anchors steadied. The tether flared bright again, its edges sharp, its wound held open by hands vast and unseen. The resonance wave thinned, its silence collapsing into broken echoes. The aperture faltered, its petals shuddering as though in disbelief. The fleet held. The convoy still lived. But Stephen saw more. Through Sentinel's bond, through the tether that linked them, he felt beyond the citadel, beyond the aperture's bloom. Beneath the surface of the abyss, deeper layers stirred. Not one fortress. Not one citadel. A labyrinth. A nesting of silence within silence, each layer vaster than the last. The citadel they faced now was not the heart. It was the gatehouse. He whispered it into the net, his voice raw, blood on his lips. This is only the outer wall. There is more. So much more. The strategium froze. Even Rivers' hands clenched against the rail. Isabella's eyes hardened like stone. Torque's silence was heavier than any curse. They had not stepped into the enemy's heart. They had only reached its threshold. The abyss inhaled again, deeper this time. The petals of the aperture trembled, widening once more, preparing its third note. And the Alliance braced for the truth that this war had only just begun. The strategium trembled with a silence that had weight. The first wave had failed to sever them. The second had broken on the wall and died in its own echo. Stephen's words lay across the table like frost. This was only the outer wall. Beneath the citadel, deeper rooms waited, nested abysses inside the first, a labyrinth not of stone but of intent. Rivers did not let the dread ripen. He gathered it like loose rope and pulled it taut. Waiting would not save them. The aperture would find a third note, then a fourth, until one of them cut clean through the tether and they vanished without even the grace of ruin. They had come to cut a path. They would cut, or they would be swallowed. Orders carried like pulses rather than speech. The convoy tightened around the anchors until the bastions could feel one another through armor, harmonic ribs interlocking into a single pressure dome. The giants lowered their centers, spread their snares as if setting a net across a river full of broken stars, and took the weight of the tethers trembling onto their backs. Inside the dome, singularity hulls shifted a span closer, unlovely and necessary. When the time came to run knives under the Citadel's ribs, they would be ready. Outside the dome, the fleet stood up. Zephyr took the first road. It had mapped the thin bridges between abyssal nodes in the middle of the battle, stealing moments where no moments had been, tagging the not-quite paths with a thief's handwriting. Now it slid along those threads, hull blurring in and out of agreement with itself, crew breath sinking to the ship's strange cadence. 2 fast cruisers paced its wake, their full-tech spines tuned to catch any bent geometry and return it with interest. Isabella took the long blade. A lost fleet spearhead formed under her hand, the ancient hulls settling into a geometry that felt like a memory too old for names. Arclight to the left, storms chained and waiting, tempest to the right, its veins whispering weather into being that had no business in a place that did not admit skies. Veteran destroyers from Earth and Sol framed the point, their tractor snares humming with the new grammar that had taught them how to pin a fold before it could snap. The spearhead aimed not at the Citadel's throat but at its flanks, where harriers gathered in swarms around staging nodes like hornets around dark sugar. Tudor armed the hinge. Marines flowed onto dropships in a practiced quiet that always made the air feel thinner. The target was a small cluster of vessels hiding in a hollow of resonance shadow beyond the left-hand road. They looked like nothing at all from a distance, a handful of rejected hulls curled around themselves like sleeping animals. Up close, they would be siege ships, throats without teeth, tuned not to kill but to be planted. If the Watchers had learned they could not keep a single kill switch intact under the Alliance's eye, they would plant 1,000 little mouths and wake them later when everyone had forgotten they were there. Tudor would not let them be forgotten. Bastions remained in thirds. 10 held the anchors, shoulders touching, shields layered until the hum thrummed in every rib aboard every ship within. 10 rolled forward in a short wall with Isabella's spear, a slow thunder that made space around them remember how to be stone. 10 took the midline between Zephyr and the Marines, a movable castle to pin threads in place and set gates for returning crews. Immovable did not mean static, it meant the enemy bent first. Senna's people walked the corridors before the detachments launched, palms open, shoulders soft, leaving low, constant lullabies wherever hands would white-knuckle and jaws would grind. Resonance shields for thought wrapped the departing crews like extra skin. The Abyss had learned to grab minds by their edges. The Alliance had learned to sand those edges smooth. Stephen stayed at the conduit as if his bones had nailed him there. The spire's hum rolled through him, steady as tide, suturing his thoughts to Sentinel's endless patience. He listened for the tremor that meant the aperture had found its breath again and listened also for the finer shiver that meant the roads Zephyr walked were shifting. If the paths moved, he would taste the motion like rain changed to sleet on the tongue. He would warn them before the ice formed. Rivers gave the last gesture, 2 fingers laid flat against the table and lifted not as permission but as inevitability. The strike groups moved at once. Zephyr's road felt like walking across the back of a sleeping leviathan with a compass that was only accurate when held upside down. The thread flexed under the ship and sprang, an elastic nothing that had habits the crew learned to anticipate one heartbeat before they would have stumbled. Patrols flickered into being and out again at the edges of sense, Watcher hulls translating across microlattices that did not exist in any sane cosmology. Zephyr never chased, it arrived. Phase fire put light where an enemy would be after an overcorrection, and voids appeared where Hull had been an instant earlier. The escorts did the less glorious work, catching rerouted shots on snares and bending them gently back into angles Zephyr had already marked as inhospitable to Watcher survival. 3 skirmishes bloomed and collapsed with the fussy efficiency of good surgery. The road ahead stayed thin but passable. Isabella's spear cut into a staging cluster that had been busy believing itself unseen. The Lost Fleet's voices spoke first, a chord of storm and fracture that unstitched a lattice of Harrier births before the swarms could bloom. Arclight's chained brilliance hopped node to node, killing the idea of formation more than the ships themselves. Tempest breathed a small climate into a pocket of resonance, pressure differentials doing what ordnance could not, turning speed into drag and drag into angle and angle into death. Human destroyers worked the edges, a fencer's parry to each angry jab, snares snapping folds until the Harrier's cleverness ate itself. The bastion wall came last and slow, 10 giants taking the space left like a claim staked in bedrock, return fire corridors drilled through their shields as steady as beats in a march. Where the Harriers survived, they fled along roads Zephyr had labeled windows. Isabella let them go. Some prey lives to lead you to the den. Tudor's hinge found the seed cluster exactly where bad instinct would have looked second. The ships were small and mean and naked, no ornament, no arrogance, their hulls pitted as if by meteors no one had been around to name. Marines hit them on a downbeat between bastion pulses, sliding into hard dock under cover of a hum set to sound like boredom. The first doors resisted with a hiss of pressure and then remembered they were doors and not lips and opened. Inside, there were no crews, only long rooms tuned to keep quiet forever, lined with nerves that would carry a wake-up note someday if allowed. The kind of work that makes rage run so clean it feels like joy. Charges went in with the restraint of craftsmen. A thing designed to sing once and die would not be given its once. Across all three push-outs, the abyss changed its posture. Nodes that had pulsed with the lazy assurance of a strong animal went alert. Patrol patterns steepened, then smoothed into purposeful arcs. The citadel lightened its petals a fraction and the space around the aperture brightened, a mouth bearing teeth but not yet biting. The sense of being watched sharpened from general to particular. Rivers read the map as if it were weather over a coastline he knew. Their strikes had taught the enemy something new, and the enemy had accepted the lesson instead of breaking against it. An intelligence with dignity was harder to beat than a will with pride. Reports flowered and were clipped, flowers pressed at once into the book of a moving battle. Zephyr clear to waypoint 3. Spearhead has gutted 2 staging cradles, 3rd compromised, 4th unwise to pursue. Bastion midline has set 2 gates, Marines have collapsed 5 siege ships and taken 2 clean for study, no triggers, no fatalities, 1 concussion, no song. The convoy at the core held its steady practice, the thing every poem forgets to praise because it is not beautiful to look at. Bastions along the wall traded layers, cooling outer plates, warming inner ones, algorithms checking for harmonic drift with the fussiness of monks repairing a cathedral floor no one was supposed to notice. Singularity hulls cycled power through fake burns to keep cryo margins within limits. Crews 8 standing up were not at all. Senna's team sat in doorways just breathing, an absurd luxury and a weapon both. Stephen felt the first hint of the aperture's 3rd breath then, not as a pressure but as an absence where pressure should have been, a hole cut in a hole that sounded like a learned pause before a soloist begins. The citadel was listening to itself, choosing pitch. He let the knowledge pass through him into the net without letting fear take any more of it than the value of the warning itself. Timelines tightened because that is what time does when it matters. No one on any deck said the word hurry. They did the things they had promised to do as quickly as they had promised to do them. Isabella's push found a spine. At the center of the staging complex, below the busy rings where Harriers hatched and died, a structure with none of their grace spun slowly. It was not a relay and not a seed. It was a power organ, built to drink what the petals shed and feed it back with a different color. Not the aperture's note itself, but a harmony that would have made the 3rd breath bite down harder on the anchors. She took it without flourish. The Lost Fleet's oldest ship laid a long, patient beam across its axis the way a farmer lays a scythe, and the organ came apart with a sigh. 1,000 small currents went slack. The air in the spearhead tasted less like metal. Zephyr skated past a blind angle and saw a thing that would matter tomorrow more than it could matter now, a maintenance lane crossing the roads at right angles, unguarded because it did not look like a road to anything with eyes. The coordinates went home tagged as a promise. Tudor stood with a hand on a bulkhead that felt like cold clay and closed his eyes long enough to say a private grace for men who get to do clean work. The 2 captured seeds in his hold slept without poison, wrapped in nonsense hum thick enough to block any song. He let the corner of his mouth move a half millimeter. The hinge would hold. Rivers let the news run through him and did not smile. The abyss had seen them and had not panicked. Good. Panic produces accidents. This enemy would have to be beaten, not tripped. He leaned into the table and watched currents change with each strike, saw gaps open and close like gills, felt the slow creep of advantage along the bones of a plan that had felt like a dare when they laid it down on cold glass. Anchors hummed steady. Bastions held. Roads stayed roads. The convoy had not bled. They had cut, not deep, but clean. Then Stephen sagged against the conduit and left a dark line on the pale stone where his nose bled. It was not the third breath yet. It was the stillness before it. The aperture's throat opened wider, and what peered through was not a wave but a shadow with weight. Something vast moved at the petal's lip, a construct not unlike Leviathan in size but wrong in its cadences, a thing built to sing rather than to bite. A throat with an instrument for a body, pulling itself forward to turn the next note from a beam into a body blow. His warning slid into the net like a blade laid on the palm. The fleet turned without drama, like a flock that had decided together, and all the small work that had been separate a breath before became one thing, bastions shifting to take the new line, Zephyr marking angles no mind should have to hold, Isabella's spearhead unstitching from the flanks and stitching itself into a form that would meet a god with manners. Tudor calling his people back to the hinges because once the throat arrived there would be no time for elegant boarding, only for the ugly art of not dying. The abyss drew its breath. The outer wall rippled, pleased with its own patience. The Alliance sent knives out ahead of the storm and did not look back. The abyss opened wider, its petals trembling as if the citadel itself drew breath. From that vast throat came a shadow greater than oblivion, greater even than Leviathan, a silhouette that bent the void around it. Not teeth. Not claws. But a cathedral of ribs and throats, a body made to sing. The resonance colossus stepped free of the aperture. Every rib pulsed with harmonic fire, conduits glowing like veins. Its frame stretched in patterns that refused perspective, too many angles, too many lengths. Where Leviathan had been hunger shaped into scale, this was music made into flesh. The silence it carried was not the absence of sound but the command that no sound had ever been. The anchors screamed. Their harmonics roared through the tether, their cores shuddering, their grips slipping. Crews across the fleet felt it at once, names sliding out of memory, places fading, the terrifying blur of reality thinning as though the abyss had almost convinced itself that they had never come. Screens flickered blank, then returned, only to flicker again. Marines clutched their helmets, muttering their names to themselves like prayers. The colossus opened its ribs. The first note tore across the void. It was not a beam, not a weapon, but a wave of erasure. Bastions caught it first, shields braced, full-tech arrays snapping shut across the resonance. The giants trembled, their harmonic plates shrieking, but they held. The wave split across them, redirected, bent away, some of it turned back against the colossus itself. Its ribs flickered, its song broken mid-chord. But not ended. River's voice carried like thunder. Hold the wall. Warhammers, fire through the gaps. The Alliance surged. Warhammers lit their broadsides, storm after storm of plasma lances ripping into corridors, bastions carved open. Explosions rippled across the colossus' flanks, chunks of its ribs cracking, resonance spilling like blood. Destroyers dove between the giants, their tractor snares locking Harriers mid-fold, twisting their fire back into their own wings. The lost fleet struck the flanks. Arc lights chained brilliance burned through escort clusters, lightning skipping across hulls and tearing them apart in showers of resonant sparks. Tempest unfolded weather where no skies existed, storms spiraling through abyssal currents, swallowing Harrier formations whole. Zephyr phased, slipping through geometries, reappearing above the colossus' spine, mapping weak points, sending back coordinates glowing like wounds waiting for knives. The colossus bent space in answer. Its ribs shuddered, its song deepened, and the battlefield twisted. Ships were torn from formation, dragged into folds, hurled across impossible angles. Escorts spun, carriers staggered, even warhammers reeled. Bastions seized the folds in their snares, locking them, freezing them, hurling them back. But some slipped through, scattering the fleet across currents where position and time no longer obeyed. The colossus swelled for another note. Its throat brightened. The anchors dimmed. Stephen clutched the conduit, blood streaming from his nose, his voice ragged with Sentinel's truth. It has a core. A harmonic heart tied to the citadel. Unless it breaks, it will sing until the anchors collapse. Every eye turned toward him, and then to Rivers. Tudor's voice cut the silence. "My Marines will go." Tudor chose the approach that punished hesitation. Dropships fell from their cradles like steel rain, black needles vanishing into the glare of bastion shields and reappearing in the torn air above the Colossus. Tractor snares reached from 3 giants at once, pinning seams in the monster's folding geometry, prying open a slit in reality wide enough for men to fit their courage through. The slit fought to heal. The bastions refused it permission. Hull met meatless bone with a shriek that carried into teeth. Magnets locked. Cutters burned. The Colossus twisted to deny entry and discovered itself pinned in a place where denial had nothing to grip. Marines stepped into corridors that were not corridors so much as instructions for where space should be if the singer remembered to breathe. They advanced anyway, boots taking the floor so seriously that the floor believed in itself for a few meters at a time. Sound was the enemy. The ship sang in structures rather than notes, harmonic pressure sliding under plates and through marrow, telling blood to be still, telling thought to soften, telling will to release its grip on names. Senna's lullabies rode the squad comms as a low, unending river. The words meant nothing. The shape of the hum meant everything. Panic found no edges to hold. The song of the Colossus broke on the soft curve of human stubbornness given a tune. Tudor cut first and often, the blade in his fist tuned to burn where resonance tried to hide in welds and joints. Sparks fanned like meteor dust. Doors remembered what doors do and opened. Chambers flickered between sizes until Marines walked them into agreement. At every third junction a rib arched overhead, vibrating with a subnote that made the tongue taste metal. Those ribs formed a map if one let nausea pass and watched the pattern of shimmering, amplitude peaked when the path bent toward the heart. They followed the sickness like hounds. Outside, the fleet became a single act of refusal. Bastions stacked shields in tiers, rotating plates fast enough to keep the harmonic load from concentrating long enough to crack anything that mattered. The giants caught shreds of the Colossus's second note and turned them back as scything crescents that cut escort clusters down to sparks. Warhammers poured fire through corridors Zephyr marked and bastions held open, broadsides written with the new grammar of fold-aware gunnery. Arclight and Tempest worked the edges, unseating Harrier timing so that every dodge arrived a heartbeat late and every fold closed on emptiness. Zephyr threaded the monster's shadow, laying ink-fine lines on the map where Tudor might need a door that did not yet exist. The Colossus gathered breath. The second note swelled beneath its bones, a pressure that made hull seams in the convoy creak, a hush that threatened to smooth the tether into a healed scar. Anchors groaned, their harmonics developed a ragged edge that told anyone listening that miracles were muscles, and muscles tear. Tudor reached the throat. It was not a chamber so much as a vortex tamed into architecture. Conduits spiraled inward, carrying the weight of the song toward a core that looked like an absence walled in stained glass. The glass pulsed with patterns too regular to be accident and too cruel to be beautiful. The core was not a gem. It was a decision made permanent, everything that enters shall forget how to be. Charges came off rucks and into hands with a ritual neatness that calmed even men who did not believe in ritual. Each device bore Illyrian counters woven through cryon containment and human kill-switch modesty. Redundancy on redundancy, humility built into detonation. The timers were not clocks. They were rhythms tuned to break the cord rather than merely bruise it. Marines set them at cardinal ribs and at the places where pattern tried to pretend it was chaos. Withdrawal would be through a door that did not exist yet. Zephyr cut it from the outside with a phase stitch that bled light into the floor and arms spanned to the right of the core, a rectangle of wrongness that felt like relief. The count began. The count ended. The Colossus tried to sing the second note. The core pulsed. The charges answered. For an instant the chamber held both truths. Then the counters won. Silence snapped inward like a spring released. The absence that had been a decision lost confidence and became a hole that refused to hold a shape. Ribs buckled inward. Conduits tore like wet paper. Marines were flung toward the wrongness in the floor and fell up through it into dropships that had been waiting with ramps already down and hands already out. The last man through brought the last hum with him, a single sustained tone that said, in the language machines use when they are honest, enough. Outside, the second note fractured. What launched from the colossus reached the bastion wall as a handful of jagged waves, each one out of phase with its brothers, each one weak where the others were strong. The giants caught them with a practiced kindness and turned them back without malice. The anchor's ragged edge smoothed. The tether brightened to a blade rather than a thread. The colossus hung stunned, ribs quivering, harmony bleeding from its seams in pale sheets. It tried to fold away from pain and found its geometry pinned in 5 places by snares that had learned a new, cruel patience. Rivers drove the warhammers in then, not with triumph, not with rage, but with the clean arithmetic that ends a fight. Broadsides walked the monster's length. Tempest laid a storm inside its empty chest that had nowhere to go but out through fractures. Arclight chained one last brilliance along every weak point Zephyr had marked, a glittering necklace of ruin. The song beast went dark. It did not die with a scream. It died with the soft exhalation of a chapel emptied of congregation. Relief moved through the fleet like a warm front. It was not jubilation. It was the ache that follows a cramp. Men and women unclenched fists and did not notice until nails left crescents in palms. Captains' boards rebuilt inventory lists with the sullen obedience of paper after fire. Damaged crews went to pieces that could be saved and left offerings of tape and prayer on pieces that could not. Tudor sat on a ramp with his helmet between his knees and let his pulse find the pace of the ship. He watched his Marines count off without being asked and saw numbers he could live with. 2 on the edge of the door had caught the wrongness badly and would walk with new gravity. They smiled with mouths that promised to relearn the step. The hinge had held again. The anchors sang their low, endless tone. The tether held. Stephen did not fall so much as fold slowly downward until the conduit caught him and made a cradle. Blood striped his lip. His eyes were far away and full of a light that was not light. He spoke without breath the way tide speaks to a rock. Beyond the citadel lay more. The signal did not end at a wall. It descended. Layer on layer, depth under depth, each with its own choir and its own instruments sleeping in scaffolds that stretched past courage. The one they had killed was the first pulled forward. Hundreds more waited like seeds in winter, not dormant, only patient. The strategium listened without interruption. There was no room in the breath after that for bravado. Rivers stood with fingers on the rail, feeling through the metal the tiny tremors that meant the Razee 2 still wanted to be alive. Isabella's face found a new hardness that was not anger. It was the acceptance of scale. Torque's shoulders made the smallest motion that could be called a nod. Numbers could be made for this. They would not be kind. The citadel did not rage. That was perhaps the worst of it. Its petals narrowed a fraction, then widened again as if adjusting a lens. The Harriers ceased the mindless bravery that had fed Alliance guns and adopted a spacing that acknowledged learning. The road Zephyr had mapped shifted half a degree, annoyance, not panic. The Abyss had seen the blade and decided to keep its fingers. The convoy reformed around the anchors with the unconscious grace of a flock that has decided it will not be hunted today. Bastions rotated fresh plates forward. Warhammers cooled barrels and swapped out scorched snare projectors for spares pulled from walls that would be bare if this went on too long. Carrier decks smelled of hot metal and citrus cleanser and unspent fear. Senna's teams moved like walking hearths, leaving rooms warmer behind them without changing the air. Reports settled into the quiet that follows truths too large to argue with. Core destroyed. Colossus neutralized. Anchors stable. Tether intact. Casualty lists appended. Ammunition at percentages that made logisticians breathe through their noses. Fold tech arrays within acceptable drift. Zephyr's coordinates archived with a caution tag that tasted like hope. Stephen's voice came one last time, thin and steady. The deeper layers were not infinite. They stacked like shelves carved into a cliff, and the path between them was not random. There were hinges in the abyss as there are hinges in any made thing. The citadel guarded the first. The next would be worse. Past that, worse again. Somewhere below all of it, not a heart, not a mind, but a will older than the chorus, the shape that taught the watchers what silence could do. Rivers let the information settle like ballast. The plan on the table was no longer a raid. It was a campaign. The 100 cores would not be extravagance. They would be breath. Fold tech would be not an advantage but a grammar for survival. Anchors could not be allowed to dim. Bastions would need to become not walls but bridges. Zephyr would have to dress its courage in thrift. Tudor would have to keep making doors out of places that hated doors. He turned from the dead song beast and looked into the bright line of the tether as if it were a road across a desert they had chosen. The promise he had made at the end of another book, in another quiet, rose unbidden and found a new edge. They would not wait for the abyss to name their end. They would write the next stanza themselves. The fleet breathed together. The abyss adjusted its aperture again. Between those motions lay a space the size of a decision. They took it. The fleet breathed like a wounded animal that still intended to run. Hulls ticked as heat walked out of metal. Shield ribs throbbed with the ache of overwork. In the hangars, crews moved with the economy of people who had already spent too much and would spend again without complaint. The dead were counted with hands, not ceremony. Names were confirmed, the lists copied twice, once for the ships that would carry them home and once for the ships that could not. The bastions rotated fresh plates forward and banished the scorched to the rear. Warhammers swapped out snarled snare projectors for spares. Carrier decks scrubbed the smell of ozone and fear into the drains. The Razee 2 Strategium gathered the survivors of authority under a light that felt colder after victory than before it. Rivers stood with his fingers on the rail, feeling through steel the tiny tremors that meant the ship still wanted to live. Isabella held her stillness like a shield, the lens of her attention turning from one readout to the next and back again as if polishing each into honesty. Torque's shoulders held their careful stone, gravity did not preen and neither did he. Senna's quiet was a weather across the room, the low hum she carried softening edges that had cut too many nerves. Stephen leaned into the conduit, Sentinel's patience wrapped around fatigue until it looked like endurance. The colossus hung dead beyond the glass. It had died as a cathedral dies, emptying rather than breaking, its ribs quiet as pews. The anchors sang their endless low note and kept the tether taut. Around them, bastions sat in layered calm, 10 and 10 and 10, a castle built from resonance and refusal. The convoy's singularity hulls huddled close like pilgrims under a storm wall. Zephyr traced lazy figure eights at the edge of the map that meant anything but idleness. There was no appetite for speeches. The facts laid themselves down because they were heavy. Ammunition percentages crept across boards in numbers that made logisticians bite their lips. Fold tech arrays held within drift but would need retuning. 3 bastions would never sing the same again, they would still throw a wall, but some chords would buzz where once they had rung clean. Carrier wings could replace the missing bodies, they could not replace the hands that had known where every rattle hid inside every cockpit. The Marines counted off and left 2 spaces empty and did not look at the spaces again. They faced the choice without dressing it. To linger was to invite another song beast or something worse to climb from the aperture while the fleets relearned how to breathe. To press deeper was to spend men, steel, and luck on roads no map trusted. The abyss had layers. The citadel was only the outer wall. Below waited choirs and scaffolds and instruments asleep in cradles older than names. The 100 cores were breath, not luxury. Fold tech was grammar, not flourish. Anchors were the bridge. Bastions were the hinges. Zephyr was the knife. Rivers took the dread and made it useful. The abyss learned with every moment they gave it. Waiting here taught the enemy how to unwrite them at leisure. Pushing, even bloodily, at least pressed ignorance into the other side. He laid his hand over the tethers line on the table and felt the tremor run into his palm like the throat of a wire before a note. They would move. Zephyr brought roads to the light. Thin filaments sketched across the abyss like cracks in glass, nearly nothing until a ship learned to trust the idea of them. The first thread ran narrow and quiet, staying close to cold current and shadow, a stealth path where patrols slipped by because the place itself preferred not to be noticed. It could pinch shut without warning and throw a ship into geometries that felt like drowning. The second lay broad and steady, a highway of sorts, lit by patrol beacons the watchers did not bother to hide. Heavy pickets bracketed it. Closed, it would take days off the descent. Held, it would gut them. The third was an erratic spiral that seemed to chase its own tail, wandering close to structures Stephen had called hinges and far again like a mood. It shifted under observation. It led toward a resonance cluster that woke the planet's sense in his blood and made him whisper the word door. The plan wrote itself with the ruthless clarity that comes when there is no fourth road. A split recon, not to win, not to occupy, but to ask questions at speed and return with answers before the aperture found a note that made return irrelevant. Zephyr would take the narrow thread with 2 fast cruisers whose captains had learned to breathe with their engines. Isabella would put a lost fleet spear on the broad way with a bastion wall and manageable depth, old ships, and new practicing the etiquette of nodal battle under a heavy gaze. Tudor would ride the erratic path with a small hinge group, destroyers tuned for snare discipline, a bastion for anchor and gate, marines ready to cut seed throats and relay lips if the path braided into something worth killing. Senna walked the lines with her palms turned up. She did not give speeches. She left hums in doorways and under consoles, in ready rooms and on the lips of cups. The abyss would press its hands into minds again. The lullabies sanded the spots panic liked to catch. Stephen mapped the threads by feel while Zephyr traced them by sight. The conduit whispered shifts to his marrow, small aches when a road twisted, a warmth when a hinge rolled its shoulder. He marked changes with a stylus that shook more than pride liked, the marks kept true. Torque named the cores like a quartermaster counts hearts. The 100 were whole. 5 had woken and slept again in drop 5's counterstroke, the self-erasure had left nothing to teach or steal. 15 would ride ready on the first push. 10 more would meet them where the roads rejoined if they lived that long. Cores in convoy were more than bombs. They were levers. Used poorly, they would rip the bridge behind the Alliance and leave them clever ghosts. Used well, they would make hinges cough. The strategium dimmed to the color of a hard dawn. Rivers set his 2 fingers on the edge of the table and lifted them the way he always did when decision shed the last of its debate. The order went out into bones and boards and hands. The fleet loosened its circle without losing its wall. Bastions leaned to let small ships slip past and leaned back to seal the lane. The anchors did not change their song, they did not know how. That was mercy. Zephyr slipped first, with the disrespect for time that only a ship built wrong learns to earn. Its escorts followed like kites in a wind only they could feel, snare arrays whispering to folded edges even before the folds declared themselves. The narrow thread took them like a cat path along a ledge where thinking about the drop was the surest way to fall. Patrol ghosts flickered and were gone. Once a Harrier pack slid past so close Zephyr's hull lights painted their bellies, and still neither side acknowledged the other because the road itself seemed to ask them to mind their own thoughts. Isabella's spear stepped onto the broad way with ceremony earned in the oldest war. Arclight and Tempest bracketed the point. Human destroyers set their snares to choir rather than solo. Behind them, 5 bastions marched at a pace that taught geometry to keep time. Watcher pickets lit up like towers along a highway. The first challenge came as a folding lance that tried to tip the road like a tray. The wall caught it, rolled it back, and set it down in the attacker's lap with a precise apology. The second challenge came as a block, 3 heavy hulls locking themselves into a crosswise knot. The spear washed around them in 2 curls, the way a river does when a boulder forgets it is not a dam, and the knot unlearned itself under pressure. Pickets learned. The spear learned faster. Tudor took the hinge road and pretended not to know he was smiling inside his visor. The path wandered like a song a child makes up, circling back to look at its own footprints, veering toward structures that had no courtesy to be symmetrical. The bastion on his left hummed with the contentment of a giant that gets to do delicate work. The destroyers picked their way like men in a glasshouse who know where the load-bearing panes live. The first thing worth killing appeared with no escort and less pride, a listening spindle tucked into a resonance eddy, an instrument that could tell the Citadel what a road felt like under prey feet and when a hinge flexed. Marines kissed it hello with cutters and left it in clean pieces. The second thing hissed from shadow with the ugly confidence of a siege ship and died confused when Snare Discipline pinned its planned fold mid-hinge and asked it to justify itself. It could not. Reports braided back to the core like strands of a rope that knew how to hold. The Narrow kept its promise of quiet but not of kindness. Thin places pinched without warning and Zephyr slapped phase fire down like planks over holes for its escorts to run. The Broadway was a parade ground that resented being used for war. The Watchers loved it because it flattered their patrol doctrine, and the Lost Fleet loved it more because doctrine is a door when someone else is knocking. The erratic road flirted with a structure that made Stephen's jaw ache and Senna's voice turn softer. A hinge, not of metal but of permission. The fleet at the core did what poems never praise. It weighted correctly. Bastions rotated plates to even the heat, fed harmonics through seams that needed to remember they were seams and not wounds. Warhammers checked internal weather. Carrier crews sat on their hands and did not run drills they did not need. The anchors sang the long note that made a doorway out of a wound. Zephyr found the first real price. The narrow thread shifted under a patrol like a rug jerked by a bored god. The second escort overcorrected and went sideways into a fold that closed with the sound of a breath swallowed wrong. The ship reappeared 20 hull lengths below the thread, intact, screaming with silent alarms, out of step with itself. Zephyr burned a stitch into the air like a lifeline and hauled it back into rhythm, crew hearts beating out of time for long minutes afterward. The lesson pressed itself into doctrine: do not admire the quiet. Measure it. Isabella's spear found a phalanx that would have been a line breaker under any other sky. 3 heavy Watcher hulls braced with 2 escorts carrying relay ribs for a smaller song than the Colossus, a pocket aria meant to make the bastion wall doubt its own width. The wall did not argue. It changed shape. Plates slid and overlapped in a new order that made a corridor where there had been a flat face, an architecture the Harriers had never had to solve. Warhammers poured light through. Arclight's chain ran along every rib that hummed the wrong key. Tempest laid a pressure drop so sudden it stole the phalanx's readiness like a gasp. The line breaker learned humility the hard way and left wreckage behind it that carried no useful lesson home. Tudor's hinge spoke in the oldest language he understood: pressure and release. The path thickened until engines felt like hands pushing honey and then thinned until the bastion's hum shook dust from old welds. Ahead, the hinge itself showed not as a gate but as a change of taste in the air. Zephyr had called it door. Stephen had whispered the same word without knowing why the word fit. The Marines saw 3 small shapes anchored at its rim, not seeds, not relays, but tuning forks waiting to be struck. They went. The forks tried to fold away. The bastion pinned too. A destroyer's snare caught the third like a chopstick catching a fly. Cutters sang. Charges knelt and then lay down. The rim cleared. Beyond the hinge, something vast glimmered like scaffolding seen through fog, a hint of the next shelf down, lit by sleeping cores stacked like lanterns in a forgotten festival. Stephen pressed his forehead against stone. The sight did not come through eyes, it rose like heat from the conduit, enough to salt his tongue with iron. He carried it into the net without drama. The next layer waited close enough to touch. The roads did not end. They continued past the hinge into a breadth that made the outer wall look small. And down there, cradles for colossi lined and counted hundreds. Not alive. Not dormant. Patient. The strategium did not gasp. It ratified. Rivers slid markers along the table and the map changed from a raid to a route. The recon had done what it was sent to do. Questions had answers that hurt but did not paralyze. The narrow was passable with discipline. The broad was survivable with doctrine rewritten on the fly. The erratic led where they needed to go if they were willing to dance without pride. The hinge could be cleared, and once cleared, could be held, briefly, bloodily, long enough for a convoy to slide through if the bastions turned themselves into a doorframe and Zephyr stitched the gaps and the Marines bled on the latch. Alarms did not scream so much as announce themselves with the calm of bad weather. Patrol signatures multiplied along the broad way, not frantic, methodical. The narrow thread wrinkled at 3 places at once as if a hand had pressed its knuckles into glass. The hinge shivered. From below, something with the shape of a choir rolled over in its sleep. Rivers did not ask for opinions he already owned. He brought the groups home like a hand closing. Zephyr skimmed back along the narrow, dropping anchoring tags that would last as long as patience. Isabella's spear unstitched from the broad way with the same care it had shown cutting in, leaving behind wreckage and the memory of discipline. Tudor's hinge group backed out without taking their eyes off the door. The forks they had killed left a clean rim for now. The fleet reformed around the anchors as if it had practiced the motion for months. The council did not adjourn so much as exhale. The next half of the work rose from the map with the inevitability of tide. The roads would not stay open. The watchers would send something with more manners than a patrol and less arrogance than a colossus to close them. Cores would have to be spent in patterns no one had rehearsed. Bastions would walk and become bridges. The anchors would be asked to hold a wound through which an army and its will must pass. Stephen wiped a line of blood from his lip and left a smear on the conduit. The deeper abyss was not infinite. It had shape. Shape meant a way through. Shape also meant hands that had made it, and hands could be broken or forced to drop what they held. He said none of that aloud. He did not need to. The map said it for him. The drop closed on motion, not rest. Recon groups docked and refueled with the speed of habit. Senna's people reset their hums at fresh thresholds. Torque's crews rolled sealed cylinders into skinned hulls under lights dimmed to the color of care. Zephyr powered down just long enough for a crew hand to put a palm flat to its skin and breathe once. Bastions adjusted their stance around the anchors until the hum underfoot felt like a heartbeat steady enough to trust again. The roads waited, thin and thick and wild. The hinge gleamed where 3 paths met. Far below, a deeper choir began to clear its throat. The abyss gathered itself like a predator that had learned the cadence of its prey. In the citadel's throat, petals narrowed and widened with the deliberation of a lens, bringing a far hinge into perfect alignment. Memory pooled in the resonance, not the praise kind, but the long recall of instruments sleeping in scaffolds and the hands that tuned them. Loss was noted, relay severed, listening posts broken, a colossus fallen, and immediately reduced to adjustment. There was no grief. There was only arrangement. The chorus layered decision over decision. More throats woke in their cradles. Not 1, not 2, but many, skeletal cathedrals flexing ribs, each tuned to a different octave of forgetting. They would not sing at the praise hulls. They would sing at the hinge. Collapse the path. Strand the fleet in the outer rooms. Let the prey learn that endurance is smaller than silence when silence is shaped. The aperture brightened. The third note gathered like weather. Far above, the tether thrummed against the anchor's palms. The Razee 2 strategium read the change as a tide pulled by an unseen moon. Boards took on the pallor of hard numbers. The map showed what Stephen had already felt, petals focusing, the hinge below lifting into the crosshairs of a song meant to break bridges. He stood with one hand on the conduit and let Sentinel's patience steady the tremor in his bones. The vision had taken its toll. It would not be allowed to steal his clarity. Rivers did not waste the breath between comprehension and command. The fleet would not linger at the threshold. The hinge would not be surrendered to a choir. They would go through, or they would write their names here on the wall and let someone braver read them later. The plan on the table lost the last of its polite edges. It became movement. Anchors deepened their hold. Archon 1 and Archon 2 sang down the tether at a pitch hull metal could not carry, a frequency for rock and rules. The wound in space shivered and healed, not closed, not open, held like a door between knees while hands worked the latch. Around that door, bastions rose in tiers, 10 and 10 and 10, a fortress rolling forward until its shadow fell over the hinge. Zephyr slipped from the line as if gravity had remembered a private promise to it. The ship's lights dimmed to the color of careful thought. Crew breath found the cadence it had learned 1 war ago. It threaded the currents ahead and stitched thin seams into a geometry that preferred not to admit seams existed. The stitches would hold for moments. Moments would be enough if everyone else believed. Isabella's spear pivoted with the poise of a practiced blade. Arclight hummed storm and fracture at the flanks. Tempest's veins unfurled, waking weather inside a place that had never known season. Human destroyers took their old discipline and dressed it in a new grammar, snares tuned to catch intention as much as shot. The spear did not aim at the citadel. It aimed at the chorus of harriers already moving to enfilade the bastion wall. Tudor's hinge group sealed armor with the finality of prayer. Dropships crouched on rails like patient hounds. The Marines' brief was not poetry. It was latchwork. Kill whatever forks would retune the door. Throw charges into anything that looked like a mouth. Live if there was time, withdraw if there was a door, die only if dying meant the hinge stayed open long enough to call that choice by a better name, duty. The first colossi rose into view with the immodesty of cathedrals walking. 3 at once, ribs arching, conduits lit, each a different hue of null, each body tuned to an octave of erasure the others did not carry. The chorus meant to braid those voices into a rope and haul the hinge shut. Behind them moved a screen of harriers, not panicked this time, spacing measured, arcs clean. The third note fell. It did not begin as a shout. It began as a pressure that coaxed metal to remember the comfort of stillness, minds to admire the grace of forgetting, the tether to consider healing as a kindness. Anchors answered from the soles of the world. Their low tones shook the marrow in every wrist and the calm in every jaw and made both stronger. The wall took the wave and turned parts of it back, not as anger, but as a mirror. Reflected silence becomes ordinary quiet. The rest of the wave met tractor snares and folds pre-written with the new grammar until its edge lost bite. The hinge flexed and held. Rivers sent the fleet forward in 3 motions that read like one. Bastions walked, plates overlapping, long corridors opening between them for warhammers to pour light down. The lost fleet cut the harrier screen to drifts. Zephyr carved doors ahead. The convoy of singularity hulls slid behind the wall as if they were weightless and not the densest secrets anyone had ever trusted to steal. The colossi deepened their harmonies. One sang the name of direction until compasses forgot which way was forward and pilots tasted tin. Another pressed at memory until 2 crews blinked and could not recall the sequence for their own shield reset, until Senna's hum filled their ear canals like warm hands and the sequence returned simple as childhood. The third leaned on distance, making meters behave like miles so that the hinge seemed to drift further away the closer they drew. Bastions learned new chords in real time. Captains burned through reserves without flinching, accepting that plates would buzz for the rest of their lives, that some frequencies would never ring clean again. They layered shields in vertical columns to defy the distance singer's stretch, stacked snares at 90 degrees to the direction singer's twist, raised internal lullabies over the shells for the memory singer's thefts. Giants that had been walls became bridges, bridges that had been bridges became hands. Zephyr kissed the hinge rim and stitched a seam so thin it might as well have been drawn in breath. The first wave of singularity hulls followed that breath. The seam shivered. The hulls slipped through. Behind them, warhammers hammered. The wall closed an inch and opened 2. It was ugly grace and it worked. The harriers adjusted with the dignity of students who want to pass the test. They began to focus not on kills, but on forcing angles that made the hinge misbehave. They tried to bend the wall's corridors into self-harm. Snares caught the inflection and taught it manners. The spear's storms filled the places where cleverness might have grown. The first colossus shifted its song, aiming not at plates or mines but into the hinge itself, seeking the hum at the door's heart. Anchors answered. Their tone climbed a fraction. Every deck felt the change like altitude. Stephen's eyes watered and then steadied. He spoke into the net with the terrible ease of a man who has become used to telling people which way the tide will take their dead. The hinge is being named. Break their mouth. Tudor did not wait for permission he had already been given. Bastions pinned a new seam. Dropships fell like punctuation. Corridors inside the first colossus tried to uninvent length. Marines walked them into agreement. The throat chapel stood unchanged at the center, a core of disciplined absence ringed by ribs that had learned the cost of arrogance. Countercharges found ribs that trembled a hair lower than the others. Timers took on rhythm. Detonation translated into meaning, no. The first colossus faltered. The hinge's hum lost the quiver in its lip. A second rose, literally singing, a lower, more patient octave. Its note widened and thickened, not attacking, surrounding, trying to suffocate the hinge's breath by making the room too soft to fill. The anchor's tone broadened in kind. Bastions angled their plates to make columns inside the hush. Zephyr cut a side seam where none belonged and pushed another wave of singularity hulls through before the quiet could swallow the stitches. Isabella's spear ate an ambush that would have ended lesser fleets. A Harrier cluster folded as one along an axis that would have pinned Warhammers between two walls of nothing. Tempest changed the pressure in the fold by fractions. The axis shifted. The trap snapped on empty space and cut its own hand. Arclight ran a chain across the back of the error and made teaching of pain. The third colossus drew breath for the oldest trick of all, a strike at the anchors through the tether, a note meant to travel the bridge and curdle the stones at the far end. The low tone from Sentinel climbed one more half-step until everyone aboard everything felt their teeth hum and thought of snowmelt in spring for no reason they could name. Stephen leaned into the conduit and the planet leaned back. The strike met a wall of geology that had been told it was a bell and decided it would be a mountain instead. Zephyr marked a door inside the second colossus. Tudor took it with the unadorned competence of a man already busy with another fight. Counterharmonics laid where the ribs met the throat. A door out cut along the curve of the wrongness that had saved them before. Detonation without swagger. A cathedral emptied of its purpose, a body left that had never learned how to die. The hinge held. The seam widened a handspan. The third wave of singularity hulls slipped through, then the fourth. A bastion burned out a quarter of its plates, making a corridor for two carriers that would otherwise have been left as expensive monuments to bad luck. The giant would sing at half its timbre forever. It did not hesitate. It did not apologize to its crew for the discomfort it would cause them in winter. Loss came anyway, because war respects arithmetic. A destroyer took a folded lance across its spine and remembered the ocean that had built its captain and split neatly in two, front half in one current, back half in another. Two dropships missed a seam by inches and found themselves in a corridor that refused to stay still long enough to learn a door. Those squads laid down charges and taught the hull to stop moving. It did, but it did not open. Names changed tense. No one wasted their breath on lies about meaning. Rivers did not look away from the table because looking away is something men who want to live do after. He moved markers with the same hand that had signed too many condolence letters and kept the pattern honest. Through. 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 The aperture brightened with a hard, thin pride. The chorus still believed this was correction, not failure. From below, a fourth colossus flexed. From the flanks, new pickets flowed in a geometry that would have been beautiful if it had not been intent. The hinge was within closing distance of a hand. The Alliance had a moment measured in shared breath to finish an impossible thing. Torque's voice arrived as numbers arranged into courage. 5 cores could go off now in a stagger that would not tear the hinge but would make the pedal stutter, would force a cough into the throat, and by the wall 3 beats. By 3 beats and the last carriers go through. By 3 beats and bastions step down the stairs instead of jumping and breaking. Rivers spent the breath the way a miser buys bread for children. Do it. Cages opened with the calm of routine. 5 black flowers bloomed where no flowers had the right to be. The abyss refused to describe them, and so they were free to do what they were meant to, make a place where the song could not happen as planned. The aperture's light fluttered. The third colossus missed its entrance. The hinge shivered and then steadied, like a hand over a candle. The wall leaned. Bastions walked as bridges in the literal sense, plates out thrust into nothing, snares pinning edges of the door that wanted to round into forgetfulness. Warhammers ducked their proud heads and scuttled like beetles across ramps that would haunt engineers' dreams for years. Carriers slid through sideways, throwing shuttles like chaff and catching them again with tractor beams because the abyss had a taste for loose things and they denied it. Isabella took the rear guard with the same expression she used when listening to a story she had already heard and still loved. The spear faced the weight of the Harrier screen and made each kill steady, unpaid for twice by exuberance. Arclight held back one chain longer than instinct demanded and lit it only when a relay's rib hummed wrong, undoing 3 knots at once. Tempest spent a storm it would have liked to keep in its pocket on a pocket of pickets that had the manners to die well. The lost fleet did not look heroic. It looked inevitable. Zephyr traced the last seam and held it open with a stitch that bled light. The final singularity holes slid through heat shimmer. 2 bastions followed, then 3, then 5, each leaving behind plates that would never ring and memories that would never leave. The count reached the number that meant enough for the plan below. The count stopped. Someone had to stay at the door. The bastions that had burned the highest stood their ground with the patience of mile markers. A carrier captain who could have slipped through and been safe read the board and recognized that safe was a smaller word than necessary. Rivers did not order the choice. He accepted it, which is harder. He carried the names into the place he kept names and closed the door on that place because he needed both hands for what was left. The hinges seemed narrowed by a finger's width, then widened by 2, then narrowed again. The aperture regained its poise. The chorus found its beat. The 4th colossus lifted its head and was politely asked to wait by an event horizon the size of an orchard. It obeyed, not out of respect, but because physics had not finished their conversation. Stephen lifted his head from the conduit and found breath enough for the only sentence that mattered. The bridge is made. Rivers gave the order that makes promises real. Go. The Razee 2 stepped, her mass feeling wrong and then right, light stuttering once, crew heart stuttering twice, then all rhythms finding each other again on the far side. The anchor's song reached down the throat instead of only up, a bass note under strange music. The convoy followed, black hearts asleep in cages that had not failed them. Bastions folded their bridges back into walls as they crossed and then into weapons as they turned. Isabella's spear came last, because some things never change and others should not. Behind them, the rear guard became an answer to a question the abyss would ask again: how much of yourself are you willing to spend to teach a door its purpose? They did not die quickly. They did not die quietly. They did not die in vain. Ahead, the second layer opened like a cavern lit by lanterns that had never been lit, scaffolds stretching farther than certainty, cradles for colossi sleeping in courteous rows. Roads multiplied. Hinges shone like wet stone. The air, the not air, tasted of numbers that could be walked on if someone wanted to risk being honest enough to try. The fleet reformed in a sky that was not a sky. Damage lists marched like soldiers on a bad parade day. Ammunition counts argued with ambition. Fold arrays hummed with a fatigue that would not drop until someone sang into their seams. Senna's quiet wrapped the places where hands shook and turned the shaking into readiness. Torque's inventories updated, grim and sufficient. Zephyr's crew pressed palms to its skin and learned a new beat. Bastions checked each other like old men taking one another's pulses and pretended not to be relieved. The anchor's tone settled into a deeper timbre. Sentinel's hum came through the conduit like tide under ice. Stephen slid down the pillar a few inches and smiled with blood in his teeth that he did not feel. The road had cost less than prophecy and more than prayer. It had held. The citadel above adjusted its lens and kept its dignity. The chorus did not understand defeat, it understood scheduling. More throats woke. More Harriers turned. The hinge they had crossed would not be left unchallenged. But the Alliance was not on the threshold anymore. It had gone inside. Rivers stood at the table and looked into a depth that was no longer rumor. The promise made at Sentinel lived here now. No more waiting, no more surviving as the only art. He felt Isabella at his side without needing to see her, felt the anchor's note in the soles of his boots, felt the quiet weight of 100 black flowers ready to be planted where songs thought they were safe. He lifted 2 fingers from the edge of the table, and around him 1,000 smaller gestures aligned with his, the choreography of a people who had found a way to do more than endure. The drop ended on motion, as it should. Engines answered. Bridges spoke. The abyss below drew breath. The Alliance drew steel. The war wrote a new stanza. They went down. Don't forget to subscribe to follow along as Buck Rivers and Earth's fleets explore the abyss.